Hey guys! Tonight we settle beside a crackling campfire in a rift valley where the earth itself is quietly pulling apart and the stories are older than most countries. The flames snap and twist in the Icelandic wind, sparks spiraling upward into a sky so dark and clear you feel like you could poke a hole in it with a roasting stick. You sit at the edge of Thingvellir. Modern Iceland calls it a national park now. But in the Saga age, this grassy plain is the beating legal heart of an entire society. The river Zara murmurs nearby, sliding over stones, as if it, too, is rehearsing lines from memory. And you, wrapped in a cloak that definitely isn't warm enough for a North Atlantic evening, are about to spend the night listening to the Icelandic sagas read beside a fire that smells faintly of birch and sheep's wool. There's something almost suspiciously peaceful about it. The moss under your boots is springy, the air crisp and clean. You probably won't survive this. By which I mean, if you had shown up here in the 10th century without a clan, a farm, or at least a cousin who owed you a favor. You'd be socially toast before your actual toes froze. Saga Iceland is polite, poetic, and only mildly obsessed with revenge. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and tell me where you're listening from, plus your local time. I want to picture this firelight stretching across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The fire pops again, and you look out over the plain. This is Thingvellir, anglicized as Thingvellir, though in Old Norse it's Lyngvellir, the assembly fields. It sits dramatically within the mid-Atlantic rift, where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates are slowly drifting apart. That's not poetic exaggeration. Geologists measure the separation at about 2 centimeters per year. You are literally sitting between continents, which feels like a dramatic place to discuss property boundaries and sheep disputes. In the year 930, Icelanders established the Althing one of the oldest parliamentary institutions in the world. That's the mainstream historical fact you can take to your next trivia night. It wasn't a parliament building with velvet chairs and microphones. It was an open-air assembly where chieftains, farmers, and lawmen gathered each summer. Booths made of turf and stone dotted the plain. People camped for 2 weeks, trading goods, arranging marriages, arguing cases, and probably gossiping about who insulted whose horse. Historians still argue whether the Althing functioned as a genuinely democratic institution, or whether power remained tightly controlled by a few dominant chieftain families. It had elements of both. Free men could attend and voice support, but influence often tracked with wealth and alliances. In other words, some things never change. You lean closer to the fire as the first saga begins to unspool in your imagination. The sagas were written down mostly in the 13th and 14th centuries, but they describe events from the 9th through 11th centuries, the so-called Saga Age. They read like calm, matter-of-fact accounts of extraordinary stubbornness. A man is insulted. He broods for 3 winters. He composes a verse about it, and then very politely he challenges someone to a duel. It's like passive-aggressive email, but with axes. A quirky tidbit flickers through your mind. Medieval Icelanders believed in landvader, protective land spirits. According to later law codes, ships approaching Iceland were supposed to remove dragon-headed prow carvings so as not to frighten these spirits. Imagine filing an official complaint because someone's boat decoration startled your invisible elf neighbor. And yet, this blending of law and lore feels perfectly at home here. The valley darkens as the sun sinks fully below the horizon. In summer, it barely dips, smearing the sky with long blue twilight. In winter, of course, it's another story. Darkness drapes the land like a heavy wool blanket. You're grateful for this in-between glow, enough to see the outlines of distant cliffs rising steeply on either side. The Law Rock Lagberg stands somewhere nearby, a natural outcrop where the law speaker would recite the law from memory. There were no printed books here in 90, no handy PDFs. The law speaker memorized the entire legal code and delivered 1/3 of it each summer over a 3-year cycle. If you struggle to remember your Wi-Fi password, imagine holding the constitutional framework of a nation in your head. The sagas describe this place with an understated tone that borders on comedic. A feud erupts. Several men die. Someone shrugs and says, "It was not thought to improve matters." You can't help but admire the emotional restraint. That's joke number 1 of the evening. When your neighbor burns down your farm, you simply note that relations have cooled. Smoke drifts across your face, and you blink. The fire smells earthy, mixed with a hint of dried dung used as fuel in treeless stretches of Iceland. Yes, that's right, wood was scarce, so people burned turf and animal dung. Cozy. Remember that next time you complain about scented candles. The sagas you're about to wander through aren't fairy tales, though they sometimes flirt with the supernatural. They are family histories, legal dramas, and survival stories rolled into one. They preserve genealogies with almost obsessive care. If someone introduces himself, you may get his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather before he even sits down. It's the medieval equivalent of listing your entire LinkedIn network before ordering coffee. And yet, beneath the names and nicknames, Eric, the red Gretier, the strong, on the deep-minded, there's a quiet pulse of humanity. People worry about reputation. They negotiate marriages carefully. They argue over hay rights and driftwood. Driftwood, by the way, was a valuable commodity in Iceland. Logs washing ashore from Siberia or North America could determine whether you repaired your roof or shivered through winter. That's your quirky economic fact for the night. The fire settles into glowing embers, then flares again as you nudge it with a stick. Around you, the plain feels wide and patient. This is where thousands once gathered, pitching tents of homespun cloth, leading horses heavy with supplies. You can almost hear the murmur of voices carried on the wind-legal arguments, flirtations, poetry, recitations. The Althing wasn't just a court. It was a social lifeline in a scattered island community. Historians still argue whether the sagas are reliable historical sources or carefully crafted literary works shaped by later political agendas. Probably both. Memory is like this fire. It throws light, but it also casts long, dancing shadows. You draw your cloak tighter. The night air presses gently against your cheeks, cool and bracing. Somewhere in the dark, water continues its steady whisper. And as you sit between continents, between fact and legend, you begin to sense that this valley is less a place and more a pause in time-wide breathing space where law, story, and survival meet. The next log settles with a soft sigh, and the sparks drift upward like tiny souls of forgotten chieftains who are, even now, debating procedural technicalities in the sky. The sparks fade upward, and without breaking the spell of the firelight, you find yourself drifting back a few decades before the Althing, before the Law Rock speeches, to a time when this island is mostly empty, windswept, and waiting. You picture a longship nosing through cold Atlantic swells in the late 9th century. The sail snaps like an impatient banner, and salt spray freckles your face. According to the medieval chronicle Icelandic book, Iceland was settled beginning around 870, largely by Norse people from western Norway. That's your solid, mainstream historical fact for this stretch of the journey. The land-taking, unfolds over several decades as families claim valleys and coastlines. You brace yourself on the ship's rail. The voyage is no weekend cruise. Navigation relies on sun, stars, memory, and maybe a bit of luck. Some later sources claim Vikings used sunstones, possibly calcite crystals, to locate the sun's position on cloudy days. Historians still argue whether these stones were genuinely used for navigation in the Viking Age, or if that's a later legend, polished by enthusiasm and national pride. Either way, you squint heroically at the horizon and pretend you know exactly where you're going. The first sight of Iceland must have been both thrilling and mildly concerning. Jagged mountains rear up from the sea, their peaks streaked with snow, even in summer. Steam curls from geothermal vents inland, as if the island itself is cooking something mysterious. There are no cities, no church bells, no neatly fenced farms, just vast lava fields, shaggy grass, and an unsettling number of seabirds judging your docking technique. One of the earliest and most famous settlers is Ingolfur Arnarsson, who, according to tradition, tosses his high-seat pillars overboard as he approaches the coast. He vows to settle wherever the gods let them drift ashore. The pillars eventually wash up in a bay he names Reykjavik Smoky Bay for the geothermal steam rising nearby. Practical, debatable, dramatic. Absolutely. You imagine explaining this real estate strategy to a modern agent? Yes, I'd like to buy wherever my furniture lands. The settlement isn't a single, organized expedition. It's more like a slow motion migration. Some settlers leave Norway to escape the consolidating power of King Harald Fairhair. Other detail preserved in saga tradition. Others come from the Norse colonies in the British Isles. Archaeology and DNA studies suggest many settlers bring Gaelic wives or enslaved. People from Ireland and Scotland. So from the beginning, Icelandic society is a blend of Scandinavian and Celtic threads woven together in turf and timber. You step ashore with them, the ground feels spongy underfoot, layered with moss and volcanic soil. There are no forests to speak of that, at least not dense ones. Early Iceland does have birch woods, but they are quickly cut for building and fuel. Within a few generations, deforestation becomes a serious problem. Sheep graze freely, nibbling young shoots before they can grow back. You can almost hear a medieval farmer sighing, "Maybe we should have thought this through," while releasing yet another flock onto fragile land. The settlers claim land by simply announcing it, writing its boundaries, and marking it as theirs. It's bold, efficient, and occasionally the beginning of a lifelong feud. The Landnámabók, or Book of Settlements, lists hundreds of early settlers and the farms they establish. It reads like an epic address book, determined to prove that everyone is related if you just go back far enough. You help raise a longhouse. Timber frames are packed with turf blocks cut from the earth. The walls are thick, insulating against brutal winters. The roof is layered with sod, so from a distance, the farm almost disappears into the landscape, like a grassy hump with a door. Inside, a central hearth burns day and night. Smoke filters upward through a vent in the roof, but much of it lingers, giving everything a faintly toasted aroma. Your eyes water constantly, but at least you won't need mosquito repellent. Daily life is a balancing act with nature. Summers are short but frantic with activity. Hay must be cut and dried to feed livestock through winter. Miss the window, and your animals starve. Winters are long, dark, and filled with storytelling, tool repair, and staring thoughtfully into flames, much like this one. You're beginning to see why sagas thrive here. When it's dark for most of the day, a good feud story is better than streaming services. A quirky detail surfaces as you settle into farm life. Driftwood is so precious that specific beaches are assigned to farms by law. Timber from Siberia, or even North America, washes ashore on Arctic currents, and whoever owns that stretch of coast owns the wood. Imagine eagerly checking the tide line after a storm like it's medieval Amazon. Prime, the settlers bring their legal customs with them. Even before the Althing is founded, local assemblies things are held to settle disputes. Honor matters deeply. If someone insults you publicly, ignoring it can lower your standing. But escalating too quickly makes you look unstable. It's a delicate dance of pride and pragmatism. Historians still argue whether Icelandic society was unusually violent compared to other medieval regions, or whether the sagas simply preserve conflicts more vividly than peaceful routines. You walk the edge of a newly claimed field. In the distance, glaciers gleam faintly under the midnight sun. Volcanic mountains loom, silent but not necessarily asleep. This island is young in geological terms, restless and creative. Eruptions will come, ash will fall. Farms will be abandoned and rebuilt. Survival here requires stubbornness, bordering on art, and yet there's optimism in these early years. Families carve out valleys, name rivers, and map their world with stories. Children grow up knowing the boundaries of their land as intimately as their own hands. Community ties stretch across fjords, maintained by seasonal travel and arranged marriages. You can feel the slow knitting together of a society that, for now, answers to no king. The fire beside you at Thingvellir snaps again, bringing you gently back to the present moment in the valley. Around you, the grass ripples in a faint breeze, just as it did more than 1,000 years ago when the descendants of those first settlers gathered here. They came from ships like the one you just imagined, from turf houses half buried in hillsides, from valleys where sheep outnumbered people and patience was a survival skill. They came carrying grievances, ambitions, and carefully memorized genealogies, and as the flames leaned sideways in the wind, you realize that this entire saga, Igits, laws, its poetry, its feuds rests on that first bold decision to steer toward a smoking, unknown shore and say, yes, we'll try here. The vast, empty landscapes of Iceland, a land of fire and ice, forged by volcanoes and carved by glaciers. When the first Norse settlers arrived in the late 9th century, they found an island devoid of native people, a blank slate upon which to build a new society. These weren't just random adventurers. They were families, chieftains, and free farmers fleeing the growing power of King Harald Fairhair in Norway, seeking a life of independence. But freedom is a complex thing. As more ships landed and settlements spread across the coastal plains and fertile valleys, the initial scattering of stubborn farms began to face new challenges. How do you settle a land dispute when your nearest neighbor is a day's ride away? What happens when a theft occurs and there's no king, no sheriff, no central authority to appeal to? The very independence they cherished was threatening to descend into chaos and blood feuds. The early Icelanders were pragmatic people. They understood that for their society to survive, let alone thrive, they needed a system, they needed rules, but they were fiercely protective of their autonomy and had no desire to recreate the monarchy they had just escaped. The solution they devised was revolutionary, a bold experiment in governance unlike anything seen in Europe at the time. The decision to simply try here was slowly maturing into something far more organized. They decided to create a general assembly, a meeting place for all free people of the island. But how would it work? What laws would they follow? They couldn't just invent a legal code from scratch. So, they sent a man, a wise and respected chieftain named LFLJT, on a remarkable journey back to Norway. His mission was not to submit, but to learn. He spent years studying the laws of the Gulating, one of Norway's regional assemblies, adapting its legal framework to suit the unique conditions of Iceland. Around the same time, another man, Grimmer Geitskar, LFLJTR's foster brother, was tasked with an equally crucial mission, finding the perfect location for this grand assembly. He traveled the length and breadth of the country, searching for a place that was accessible, defensible, and could accommodate thousands of people. He found it at a place called Thingvellir, or Assembly Plains. Thingvellir was a natural fortress, a stunning rift valley created by the pulling apart of the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates. Sheer rock walls provided excellent acoustics, and a river running through the valley offered fresh water. It was centrally located, a challenging but achievable journey from all corners of the country. In the year 930, the first Althing convened at Thingvellir, marking the birth of the Icelandic Commonwealth and one of the world's oldest parliamentary institutions. Imagine the scene. For 2 weeks every summer, this quiet valley transformed into a bustling hub of activity. Chieftains, known as Gogr, arrived with their entourages, setting up temporary homes, or buir, along the riverbank. Farmers, merchants, poets, and craftsmen came from every district. It was more than just a political gathering, it was the social event of the year. News was exchanged, alliances were forged, marriages were arranged, and goods were traded. It was the beating heart of the Icelandic nation. At the center of it all was the Lagberg, the Law Rock. This was the stage. From this natural podium, the LGS Skumor, or law speaker, would recite the entire legal code of Iceland from memory over the course of 3 years. He was the living repository of the law, elected for a 3-year term, and his role was to advise the assembly, not to rule it. He held no executive power, a clear testament to the Icelanders' aversion to concentrated authority. The Althing had 2 main components. The first was the Elgretta, the Legislative Council. This was the core of the assembly, composed of the 39 Gogr, their advisors, and later, bishops. The Elgretta had the power to create new laws, amend old ones, and grant exemptions. Every free man present at the assembly had the right to listen, but only the members of the Elgretta could vote. This was their solution to balancing broad participation with effective decision-making. The second, and perhaps more dramatic component, was the court system. The Althing served as the supreme court for the entire country. Disputes that couldn't be settled at local assemblies were brought here for final judgment. Cases were argued publicly, with plaintiffs and defendants presenting their evidence and calling witnesses before a panel of judges. Appointed by the Gogr, justice was a public spectacle, a critical part of the community's fabric. These were not just dry legal proceedings. The sagas are filled with accounts of dramatic court battles at the Althing, where eloquent speeches, clever legal maneuvering, and sometimes the threat of force determined the outcome. In a famous case from Ungela's saga, the hero Gunnar is outlawed by the Althing. The sentence meant he had to leave Iceland forever. Any man could kill him without penalty if he remained. It demonstrates the ultimate power the Althing held over an individual's life and fate. The system was ingenious, but it had a fundamental weakness. The Althing could pass laws and deliver judgments, but it had no executive branch to enforce them. Enforcement was left to the victorious party. If a man won his case, it was up to him and his supporters to carry out the sentence. Whether it was collecting a fine or enforcing an outlawry, this often led to further violence, perpetuating the very feuds the law was meant to resolve. The system relied heavily on the honor and power of the individual chieftains. For over 300 years, this delicate balance held. The Icelandic Commonwealth, governed by the laws of the Althing, fostered a unique and vibrant culture. It was during this period that the incredible Icelandic sagas were written, chronicling the lives, loves, and conflicts of the first generations of settlers. This literary explosion was a direct result of a society fascinated by law, genealogy, and the stories of its people, all of which converged at the annual meeting at Thingvellir. However, over time, the balance of power began to shift. A few powerful families began to consolidate chieftaincies, buying up power and creating a new aristocracy. The old system of independent Gogr weakened and internal strife grew more intense. The Norwegian crown, ever watchful, saw an opportunity. By exploiting the internal conflicts, the King of Norway was eventually able to persuade the Icelandic chieftains to accept his rule. In 1262, the Icelanders signed the Old Covenant, swearing fealty to the Norwegian king. The era of the independent Commonwealth was over. The Althing continued to meet at Thingvellir, but its power was greatly diminished. It became primarily a court of law, its legislative authority now subject to the will of a foreign king. Yet, the memory of its golden age, of a free people governing themselves through a common assembly, never faded. It became a cornerstone of Icelandic national identity, a symbol of independence, and a deep-rooted respect for the rule of law. Today, you can walk through the dramatic landscape of Thingvellir National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You can stand where the Law Rock once stood and look out over the plains where thousands gathered each summer. The Althing itself was eventually moved to Reykjavik, where it continues today as Iceland's modern parliament, but its soul, its origin story, remains here, in this valley, etched into the very rock of the land. It's a powerful reminder that the search for justice and a society built on laws, not on the whims of kings, is a timeless human endeavor. The Icelandic Althing stands as a remarkable testament to what a free people can achieve. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into history, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories from our past. Imagine this: the year is 930. We're in Iceland at a place called Thingvellir. A massive crowd of people, a sea of faces, is gathered, their murmurs and conversations hushed. All eyes are on one spot: Lagberg, the Law Rock. A single figure stands there, clears his throat, and the entire assembly falls silent. This man is the law speaker, and for the next few moments, he is the most powerful person in Iceland. His voice is the law. The job of the law speaker, or LGS Skumor, was one of immense power and crushing responsibility. For a 3-year term, he was required to memorize and recite every single law of the Icelandic Commonwealth. Think about that. In a society that was largely oral, with no vast libraries of legal scrolls or armies of scribes to assist him. He was the living, breathing embodiment of the entire legal system. He had to stand before the assembly with nothing but the wind and the thousands of attentive Icelanders hanging on his every word and recite 1/3 of the law code each year. The pressure must have been incredible. One mistake, one slip of the tongue, could have huge consequences. So how was this even possible? Well, the Icelanders were practical. The location itself, Thingvellir, helped. The dramatic cliffs of the Rift Valley create a natural amphitheater. The acoustics are surprisingly good, allowing a single, clear voice to carry a long way, reaching the ears of the assembled crowd. The laws themselves were also structured for easy memorization. They weren't written like a modern legal textbook. Instead, they used formulaic phrasing, alliteration, and clear logical sequences. Repetitive openings and predictable structures made the vast body of law more like a long, intricate poem or song, easier to commit to memory than a block of dense prose. But did one person really memorize it all, word for word? Historians have a lively debate about this. Some argue that, yes, through incredible mnemonic skill, the law speaker held the entire corpus in his head. Others suggest a more collaborative model. He would have known the key formulas and the general structure, but the community itself acted as a collective memory. If the law speaker made a mistake or fumbled a passage, there would have been hundreds of chieftains and farmers in the crowd who knew that specific law because it affected their lives directly. They would subtly, or not so subtly, correct him. The recitation was less a solo performance and more a shared ritual, a reaffirmation of the laws they all lived by. And these laws weren't just abstract principles. They governed every aspect of daily life. The law speaker would recite the intricate rules of inheritance, how property passed down through male lines, the specific circumstances under which a woman could inherit land, and how dowries and marriage agreements were to be regulated to prevent disputes. The laws even governed violence. For a time, Icelandic law allowed a practice called holmgang, a formal duel to settle a dispute. But this wasn't a chaotic brawl. It had strict rules, a specific size for the dueling area, the number of shields allowed, and the conditions for surrender or victory. It was a fascinating attempt by the legal system to contain and regulate even the most primal conflicts. Eventually, holmgang was outlawed as it became a tool for bullies and skilled fighters to legally steal property. Bringing a case to the assembly was a highly procedural affair. You couldn't just show up and complain. You had to follow precise steps like formally naming witnesses at the right time and in the right place, and making declarations in front of specific groups of people. A mistake in procedure could get your case thrown out before it was even heard. And what about enforcement? Without a king, police force, or standing army, how did the system work? It relied on social pressure, alliances, and the very real threat of force. If you won a case and the other party refused to comply, it was up to you and your allies to enforce the judgment. This meant that law and the ever-present possibility of a feud existed in a tense, uneasy partnership. A legal victory was only as good as the power you had to back it up. You might get the impression from the Icelandic sagas that life was just one dramatic blood feud after another. While those certainly happened, the legal system was designed primarily to prevent them. The core of this was the concept of compensation payments, known as wörglæti. The law assigned a specific monetary value to every person and two different types of injuries. If someone was killed or hurt, instead of launching a revenge cycle that could decimate families for generations, the offending party could pay a set amount to the victim's family. This turned a matter of honor and blood into a financial transaction. Historians debate how effective this truly was. Did it really reduce violence, or did it just reframe it in legal terms, allowing the wealthy to literally get away with murder? The answer is probably a bit of both. It was a pragmatic system for a pragmatic people. But the Althing Assembly wasn't just about law. For 2 weeks every summer, it was the social, political, and economic center of the entire country. People gathered not just to hear the law, but to trade goods, arrange marriages, and gossip. News from distant fjords and from overseas spread through the crowds. Young men and women flirted and began courtships. The law speaker's role wasn't limited to his annual recitation either. During the assembly, he acted as a legal consultant. Chieftains would come to him with tricky legal questions, and his interpretation carried enormous weight. We see in the sagas how clever characters would try to phrase their questions to the law speaker in just the right way to get a ruling that gave them an advantage in their disputes. His wisdom and impartiality were key to the system's survival. This entire system, running on memory and social agreement, was incredibly fragile. A few bad harvests could put everyone on edge. A charismatic but disruptive chieftain could challenge the established order. A foreign power, like the King of Norway, could exert influence and pull the delicate structure apart. Yet for over 300 years, from 930 until the mid-13th century, Iceland managed itself this way. A nation without a king, guided by the spoken word, a grand annual assembly, and the power of collective memory. It's a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the early Icelanders. When you think about it, the idea of an entire society running on memorized law is both deeply impressive and a little terrifying. It places an immense trust in human memory and community integrity. As we imagine the law speaker's voice falling silent after his long recitation, the crowd begins to break apart. They move off to their own booths to argue their cases, forge alliances, and settle disputes. The law rock stands silent once more, but the air still seems to echo with the words spoken, their words of land, honor, inheritance, and obligation, carried on the wind across the centuries. In medieval Iceland, the law wasn't carved in stone. It lived in breath, in memory, and in the shared agreement to listen. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey back in time, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories from history. See you next time. The echo of the law speaker's voice fades into the cliffs, but the peace it promises is conditional. Because as you remain by the fire, watching embers pulse like slow heartbeats, you begin to understand that law in Saga Iceland doesn't replace conflict. It manages it sometimes. On good days, you picture two neighboring farms in a narrow valley. Sheep wander. Hay dries in tidy rows. Everything looks calm enough then. So someone mentions that last summer, a boundary marker may have been nudged a suspicious few feet downhill. In a land where arable soil is precious and winters are long, a few feet matter. Honor matters even more. Feud is not random chaos here. It follows patterns. One insult leads to a demand for compensation. If that fails, a killing may occur. That killing triggers a lawsuit at the Althing or retaliation. The system offers a ladder down from violence, but it also acknowledges that humans are, well, human. A firm historical fact. Icelandic law provides for compensation payments called wergold for injuries and deaths. The amount depends on the status of the victim. Payment is meant to prevent cycles of revenge by converting loss into silver. It's pragmatic, almost accountant-like. You killed my cousin. That will be 3 marks of silver and 2 milk cows. Not exactly warm, but structurally useful. Historians still argue whether this compensation system genuinely reduced long-term bloodshed, or whether powerful families simply absorbed fines as the cost of doing business. The sagas offer examples of both successful settlements and spectacular failures. Sometimes silver smooths everything over. Sometimes it just funds the next round of weapons. You lean closer to the fire and imagine what it means to be declared an outlaw. There are no prisons in medieval Iceland. Instead, if you commit a severe crime and are sentenced at the Althing, you may be given full outlawry. That means you are stripped of legal protection. Anyone can kill you without penalty. Your property can be seized. You are, legally speaking, a ghost with a target on your back. Lesser outlawry lasts 3 years temporary exile. Full outlawry is permanent. It's society's way of saying, we tried paperwork. Now please leave. A quirky tidbit surfaces from saga lore. Some outlaws survive by hiding in remote valleys, lava caves, or mountain huts, occasionally aided by sympathetic friends. They become almost mythic figures, half criminal, half folk hero. One saga even describes an outlaw who swims icy fjords and composes poetry about his loneliness. Imagine being so dramatic that even your exile has a soundtrack. You can't help but picture the practical side. Iceland's interior is harsh glaciers, volcanic deserts, sudden storms. Surviving there without a support network is brutally difficult. Outlawry is not just a legal sentence, it's an environmental one. Feuds themselves often begin with something that sounds to modern ears astonishingly small. A stolen piece of driftwood, a harsh word at a feast, a botched marriage negotiation. But in a tightly knit honor culture, reputation is currency. Public insult chips away at your standing, and if you don't respond, others may treat you as weak. That's joke number 1 for this section. In Saga Iceland, We Need to Talk is historically followed by either a lawsuit or a spear. You imagine standing at the Althing as a case is argued. Witnesses recount events in careful detail. Technicalities are examined. Did the plaintiff declare the suit at the proper time and place? Were the correct number of witnesses present? Legal precision becomes a weapon as sharp as any blade. There is a mainstream truth here that grounds the drama. Icelandic society during the Commonwealth period, 9301-262, lacks a central executive authority. Enforcement depends on kinship networks. If you win a case, your family and allies must help ensure the verdict is honored. Law without muscle is suggestion, and yet it works often enough. For over 3 centuries, this decentralized system holds together. Feuds flare and fade. Families rise and fall. The Althing reconvenes each summer, offering structure. Historians still argue whether saga authors exaggerated feuding to heighten drama, or whether violence was indeed a defining feature of the era. Archaeological evidence suggests that while conflict occurred, daily life was likely more routine and cooperative than the sagas alone might imply. After all, you can tea-farm hay effectively if you constantly chasing someone across a lava field with an axe. You smile faintly at that image. Imagine trying to maintain dignified vengeance while tripping over uneven moss. Even revenge here requires good footing. Some feuds become legendary. Entire generations are shaped by a single quarrel. Children grow up knowing the names of those who wronged their kin decades earlier. Memory stretches long in a land with few distractions. Winter storytelling keeps grudges warm. And yet, you also notice something quietly admirable. The sagas often portray characters who seek settlement, who carefully calculate when to push and when to yield. Strategic restraint can be as heroic as bold attack. A well-negotiated truce earns respect. You watch the fire shift, embers collapsing inward. It reminds you of how feuds can implode when too many players are drawn in. Alliances complicate matters. A small dispute can escalate if in-laws or distant cousins decide to intervene. In a society where most people are connected by blood or marriage, neutrality is rare. There's a peculiar legal mechanism called self-judgment, where a victorious party can determine the penalty in certain cases. It sounds dangerously biased, and sometimes it is, but it also allows flexibility. The system trusts individuals to balance pride with pragmatism, or at least to fear the consequences if they dawn. You inhale the cool air and think about how precarious all of this feels. A society built on law but lacking centralized force. A culture that prizes honor yet offers structured alternatives to endless revenge. It's a constant negotiation between principle and survival. The wind quiets. The valley seems to hold its breath. In the distance, dark cliffs loom like silent witnesses to centuries of disputes. They have seen men declared outlaws, families reconcile, silver weighed carefully in settlement. And as you sit beside the fading glow, you understand that Saga Iceland is not a world of chaos. It is a world of calibrated conflict. Anger has rules. Vengeance has paperwork. Even exile is processed through collective decision. The embers pulse softly, like the last words of a heated argument settling into uneasy truce. Here, under the vast Icelandic sky, you begin to see how fragile and how resilient this balance truly is, law and feud circling each other, either ever fully extinguished. The fire settles, but the air still crackles with the memory of feuds and outlaws. As the last embers glow, you start to see something else flickering in the valley names. Big names, names that carry the weight of a storm cloud. Because Saga Iceland isn't just about preserving disputes, it's about preserving personalities. Forget distant kings and golden halls. These are landowners with muddy boots and very strong opinions. Farmers, poets, explorers, and troublemakers. Let's let the firelight illuminate a few of them. One of the most famous is Egil Skallagrimsson, the fierce, complicated hero of Egil's saga. He's a poet and a warrior, which in saga terms means he can compose a brilliant poem and then casually threaten someone, all before breakfast. Now for a solid fact. Scholars believe Egil was a real 10th century poet, or skald, even though the saga about him was written down centuries later. Many saga heroes are likely based on historical figures, even if their stories got a literary polish over time. Picture Egil at a feast, brooding. Someone insults him because someone always dishoned instead of flipping the table. He composes a verse so sharp it might as well have edges. In one famous story, he saves his own life by improvising a praise poem for a king who was about to execute him. Talk about performance under pressure. Forget karaoke nerves. This is impress the ruler or lose your head. Historians still debate whether the sagas accurately preserve these personalities or if later authors shaped them into archetype symbols of courage, stubbornness, or tragic pride. It's probably a bit of both. Memory has a way of turning people into symbols, especially in a culture that valued lineage so intensely. And lineage was everything. The sagas are obsessed with genealogy. Before you even learn what a character does, you learn who their father was and their father's father, and maybe that gretuncle who once won a wrestling match against a berserker. It's like a medieval social media bio, but instead of listing hobbies, you list your family's feuds. Imagine a young man at the Althing, Iceland's ancient parliament. He doesn't just say his name, he anchors it in his ancestry. Identity here is collective. Your family's honor travels with you. If your grandfather was wise and fair, that reputation gives you a cushion. If he was known for impulsively setting barns on fire, well, good luck with that. Now, let another larger-than-life figure step into the firelight, Grettir Asmundarsson. The tragic hero of Grettir's saga. Grettir is strong, unlucky, and always on the out of acceptance. After a series of misfortunes, he's declared an outlaw and forced to survive alone for 20 years. The saga paints him as both fearsome and strangely vulnerable. It's one of the most psychologically nuanced portraits in all of medieval literature. Here's a quirky detail about Grettir. He's said to be afraid of the dark. Despite being formidable enough to wrestle undead monsters, this towering outlaw quietly admits he'd prefer a nightlight. It's a strangely human detail that softens his mythic edge and makes him feel real. You start to realize that saga heroes are rarely flawless. They're brave, yes, but also stubborn, reactive, and sometimes disastrously proud. That complexity feels surprisingly modern. They don't always win. Sometimes they misjudge things. Sometimes their greatest enemy is their own temper. There's a mainstream historical truth woven through these stories too. The sagas were largely written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, a time of major political upheaval in Iceland. It's possible that the authors used tales of earlier heroes and their conflicts to subtly comment on the power struggles of their own era. So when you read about a chieftain whose arrogance leads to disaster, you might also be reading a quiet critique of a contemporary leader. Historians still argue about this. Did the saga authors intend to make political statements, or were they simply trying to preserve beloved old tales? The debate continues, scholarly and spirited, like a very polite feud conducted with footnotes. As we look into the fire, we also think about the women behind these heroes, the mothers who give sharp advice, the wives who issue challenges, the daughters whose marriages forge critical alliances. Even when they're not swinging swords, they shape events decisively. But their fuller stories deserve their own time. For now, just notice how often a hero-esque path is nudged or shelved by a sharp-tongued female relative, reminding him of his honor. And there's humor threaded through these grand narratives. Saga understatement remains undefeated. A character might survive a shipwreck, a lawsuit, and a near-fatal duel, only to comment that it was a difficult season. You have to admire that level of emotional restraint. That S, our second joke, medieval Iceland, basically invented the art of saying, "I'm fine," while absolutely not being fine at all. Imagine a winter evening inside a turf longhouse. Smoke curls toward the roof vent. Outside, snow presses against the walls. Inside, someone begins to recite a saga. Children listen with wide eyes. The elders nod at the familiar names. The story reinforces who they are: descendants of settlers, survivors of a harsh land, and inheritors of a reputation they must uphold. These heroes aren't distant legends carved in marble. They are farmers, poets, and sailors. Their greatness lies as much in their endurance as it does in moments of glory. For them, a good harvest could be as triumphant as a victorious duel. And yet, you can also sense the cost of living by such an intense code of honor. Pride drives courage, but it also drives escalation. A cutting remark at a feast can ripple outward for years, causing damage that lasts for generations. These heroes sometimes become cautionary tales, showing what happens when pride goes too far. The wind brushes across the fields of Thingvellir, flattening the grass in gentle waves. You realize that the saga heroes are like this very landscape, stark, resilient, and shaped by immense pressure. Just as volcanoes and glaciers carved this island, conflict and law carved its people. The embers are glowing low now, steady and warm. Around you, the valley feels vast enough to hold all these names without collapsing under their weight. Egil's sharp verses, Gredius, lonely exile, and the countless farmers whose stories did UNT make it into manuscripts, but whose lives formed the backbone of this incredible age. And as you sit here, listening to the imagined rhythm of saga, prose measured, spare, and quietly ironic, you understand why these heroes endure. It's not because they were perfect, but because they were vividly, stubbornly, and unforgettably human. The fire shifts softly, as if turning a page. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the world of the sagas, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories from history. See you next time. The page turns gently in your mind, and with it comes a question that hovers over the valley like a cautious cloud. What happens when a society built on Norse gods' ancestral honor and carefully memorized law is asked to change its faith? You remain by the fire at Thingvellir, but now the year is close to 1000. The island has been settled for over a century. The Althing meets each summer as usual. Feuds simmer. Trade ships arrive from Norway carrying timber iron gossipand, a new religion that refuses to stay politely on the sidelines. Christianity, that's your solid historical fact. Around the year 1000, Iceland officially converts to Christianity, and the decision is made at the Althing itself. Unlike many regions of medieval Europe, Iceland's conversion is remarkably peaceful and politically negotiated rather than imposed by conquest. You imagine the tension building in the days leading up to the assembly. Some chieftains have already converted, influenced by their ties to Norway, where King Olaf Tryggvason is actively promoting Christianities, sometimes with persuasive speeches, sometimes with less subtle methods. Others cling to the old gods, Odin, Thor, Freya. Temples still stand on certain farms. Sacrifices are still made at seasonal feasts. The debate at Thingvellir is not casual, it's existential. Religion is not just belief, it's identity, law and tradition woven together. Accepting Christianity means aligning more closely with Norway and the wider European world. Rejecting it risks political isolation and, possibly, trade consequences. At the heart of this moment stands Wargeir Leosvetning Gogoi, the law speaker at the time, according to tradition recorded in later sources. When the assembly becomes deadlocked between pagan and Christian factions, Wargeir is asked to make a final decision. You picture him withdrawing beneath a cloak, lying down for a full day and night to contemplate. It's such a wonderfully dramatic image. The fate of a nation decided by a man essentially taking a very serious nap. Historians still argue whether this detail is literal or symbolica. Literary device to emphasize the gravity of the moment. Either way, it works. When Wargeir rises, he announces that Iceland will adopt Christianity as its official religion, but with a compromise. For a time, certain pagan practices may continue in private. Eating horse meat, exposing infants, and sacrificing to old gods can persist discreetly, though public worship will shift to the Christian framework. It's a pragmatic solution. Outward unity, inward flexibility. Classic Iceland. You can almost hear the collective exhale across the valley. Instead of splitting into religious civil war, the island chooses cohesion. That S-joke number 1 for this section. When faced with a divine showdown between Thor and Christ, Iceland decides to file a compromise agreement. The conversion has real consequences. Churches begin to appear, often built from turf and timber like longhouses, but marked by crosses. Priests arrive, sometimes from abroad. Literacy slowly expands because Christianity brings with it the Latin alphabet and manuscript culture. Over time, this will help preserve the very sagas you're listening to in your imagination. A quirky tidbit drifts into the firelight, even after official conversion. Some people reportedly continue to invoke the old gods in private or in moments of crisis. Archaeologists have found Thor's hammer pendants buried alongside Christian crosses in some graves, suggesting a period of spiritual overlap. It's as if people are hedging their metaphysical bets, just in case. Historians still argue how deep and immediate the conversion truly was. Did belief shift quickly, or did old practices linger for generations beneath a Christian surface? The written sources, composed later, often frame the change as decisive and orderly. Reality is probably messier. You imagine a farmer standing in his field after the Althing's decision. He looks at the sky, at the same northern lights and storm clouds his ancestors watched. Does he feel different? Does he worry that Thor will be offended? Or does he shrug and think, as long as the hay dries and the sheep stay put, I can adjust my prayers. The law adapts to Christian norms influence legislation, new rules about marriage, morality, and church authority. Bishop sees are eventually established at Skalholt and Holler, anchoring ecclesiastical structure in Icelandic soil. The island is now spiritually tethered to Europe. And yet, something fascinating happens. The old myths don't vanish. Instead, they survive in story. Snorri Sturluson, whom you'll meet properly, later writes down the prose Edda in the 13th century. Preserving Norse mythology in detail, without Christian era literacy, much of that mythic world might have disappeared entirely. So, in a paradoxical twist, Christianity helps save the memory of paganism. The fire crackles softly. You think about how adaptable this society has already proven itself to be, settling a volcanic island, creating a stateless legal system, negotiating faith without collapsing into chaos. There's a resilience here that feels almost geological. You glance toward the dark silhouette of the law rock. It has heard invocations to Odin and declarations in the name of Christ. The stone remains indifferent, yet steady. The conversion also strengthens ties to Norway, which will matter greatly in the coming centuries. Political currents flow alongside religious ones. What begins as a spiritual shift will ripple into questions of sovereignty and allegiance. But for now, in this moment, around the year 1000, you sense relief more than upheaval. Families return to their farms with a new official faith and old habits not entirely extinguished. Churches rise slowly across valleys. Baptisms replace certain rituals. And winter storytelling continues now, with saints' tales woven alongside sagas of Egil and Grettir. The wind quiets. The fire settles into a gentle glow. Above you, the sky stretches vast and untroubled, as if it has room for both hammer and cross. And you realize that here at Thingvellir, beneath open air and drifting sparks, a nation once chose unity over fracture, deciding that belief, like law, could be negotiated beneath the same wide sky. The sky above Thingvellir feels wider after that decision, as if it has made room for both old gods and new prayers. The fire burns low and steady now, and as you watch the embers shift, you begin to notice that the saga world is not only shaped by chieftains, poets, and law speakers. There are other forces at work quieter on the surface, but no less decisive. You start to see the women. Saga literature is often remembered for its duels and lawsuits, but woven through nearly every major story are women whose words redirect entire bloodlines. A grounded historical fact, women in medieval Iceland, while not politically equal to men, possessed more legal rights than many of their European contemporaries. They could inherit property under certain conditions, request divorce, and manage households in their husband's absence. In a land where survival depended on competent management, that authority mattered. You picture a longhouse in winter. Snow presses against the turf walls. Inside, a woman oversees food stores, directs servants, monitors weaving, and calculates how long the hay will last. Her decisions determine whether everyone makes it to spring. That's not background work. That's executive leadership with a wool apron. One of the most formidable saga figures is Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, who appears in the Vinland sagas. She travels from Iceland to Greenland and then to North America, becomes a mother in the New World, and later undertakes a pilgrimage to Rome. Your historical anchor Gudrid, is presented in the sources as a real woman connected to the early exploration of North America. Imagine crossing the Atlantic in the 11th century and still finding time for spiritual reflection tours. Historians still argue how much of Gudrid's story is strictly factual and how much has been shaped by later storytelling. But her presence signals something important. Women are not passive scenery in these narratives. They migrate, negotiate, and influence. You think of another unforgettable saga woman, Halgerur H. Sköldsdóttir from Ungel Saga. Halgerur is sharp-witted, proud, and unapologetically reactive. An insult doesn't slide past her unnoticed. In one famous scene, she refuses to give her husband food during a crisis because he once slapped her. It's a domestic moment that spirals into tragedy. The sagas don't soften her edges. They let her be complex. Here's your quirky tidbit. In several sagas, women are depicted goading men into revenge by reminding them of their honors, sometimes literally handing them weapons. Scholars even use the term incitement scenes to describe these moments. Picture someone calmly weaving while also strategically escalating a feud, multitasking at an elite level. But the sagas don't present women as one-dimensional instigators. Many act as peacemakers, urging settlement over bloodshed. Some offer legal insight, advising husbands or sons on how to frame cases at the Althing. Their influence often operates through speech rather than sword. You realize that in a society without centralized authority, the household is a critical unit of power. And the household is often run day-to-day by women. Property management, textile production, food preservation. These aren't side tasks. Wool cloth, called wadamol, even functions as a form of currency. So weaving isn't just craft, it's economic infrastructure. That S-joke number 1 for tonight, S-reflection. Medieval Icelandic women didn't need spreadsheets. They had looms. Divorce is another revealing element. Under Icelandic law, a woman can initiate divorce by declaring it before witnesses, provided she follows proper procedure. The sagas include examples of women leaving marriages over mistreatment or incompatibility. It's not common, but it's possible. In a time when many European societies tightly restrict such options, Iceland's legal framework stands out. Historians still argue how frequently these rights were exercised in practice versus how often they remained theoretical. Saga narratives may emphasize exceptional cases rather than everyday norms. Still, the legal possibility exists, and that shapes expectations. You imagine a summer at the Althing, men argue cases near the Larrock, but women attend to they observe, exchange news, solidify alliances through marriage arrangements. Social strategy doesn't pause during legal debates, it thrives in the margins. There's also spiritual authority shifting during and after the conversion to Christianity. Women enter religious life as nuns in the centuries that follow. Convents are established, offering new roles beyond marriage and motherhood. The religious transformation subtly broadens social pathways, and yet, saga women remain vividly individual. Some are generous and wise, others are fierce and calculating. They hold grudges, forgive debts, manipulate outcomes, protect children. They are allowed emotional range. You look into the fire and think about how easy it is to imagine the saga age as entirely male-dominated spectacle. But the stories themselves resist that simplification. The dramatic duels often originate in a tense conversation inside a longhouse, between spouses or relatives. Words set events in motion long before weapons do. Here's joke number 2. In Saga Iceland, if someone says, "Let's discuss this at home," you know the next chapter will be eventful. The wind slides softly through the valley grass. You imagine women standing at doorways, watching riders approach with news from the Althing. Verdicts ripple through households, compensation payments affect dowries. Outlaw sentences reshape family survival plans. Even storytelling itself, those winter recitations that preserve memory, happens in spaces managed by women. The domestic interior becomes the cradle of national narrative. Historians still argue how closely saga depictions reflect real gender dynamics of the 10th and 11th centuries versus 13th century literary ideals. But regardless of precise accuracy, the cultural memory honors women as consequential actors. The fire glows steady and warm. In its light, you see not just warriors and poets, but figures standing firmly in doorways, hands steady on wooden thresholds, voices measured yet powerful. And as sparks drift upward into the cool Icelandic night, you sense that the saga age is not simply a tapestry of heroic men. It is a woven fabric strong because of the threads that run quietly, decisively through every household. The woven threads of household life stretch outward now, beyond turf walls and valley fences, tugging you gently toward the sea. Because as self-contained as Saga Iceland can feel sheep law courts, dramatic glances across hayfields is never truly isolated. The fire beside you crackles, and in its glow you begin to see ships again. Long, lean vessels resting on pebbled shores, oars stacked neatly, sails drying in the wind. A firm historical fact anchors you here throughout the saga age. Iceland maintains regular trade connections with Norway, the British Isles, and later other parts of northern Europe. Despite its remote location, the island depends heavily on imported goods, especially timber, iron, grain, and luxury items. In exchange, Icelanders export products like wool cloth, dried fish, and walrus ivory. You picture yourself walking down to a small harbor in early summer. A narrow, broad-bellied merchant ship has just arrived from Norway. Its hull creaks softly as cargo is unloaded. Barrels of grain, iron tools, perhaps a few finely crafted swords for those who want their disputes to look particularly impressive. Timber is especially prized. Iceland's limited forests cannot sustain large-scale building for long, and by the 10th century, deforestation is already noticeable. Driftwood remains valuable, yes, but shiploads of lumber from Norway are even better. Imagine waiting all year for a shipment of planks, the way you might wait for a package delivery today, except instead of tracking updates, you scan the horizon and hope the weather cooperates. Walrus ivory becomes one of Iceland's more unusual exports. Walruses once haul out along parts of Iceland's coast, and their tusks are highly valued in Europe for carving luxury items, including chess pieces and religious objects. There's ongoing scholarly debate about how significant Icelandic walrus hunting truly was in the broader medieval ivory trade. Historians still argue whether overhunting contributed to the disappearance of walruses from Icelandic shores, or whether climate shifts played the larger role. Either way, it's a reminder that even remote societies participate in global demand cycles. You imagine traders haggling on the shore, weighing silver and cloth. Wadmalth, the homespun wool cloth produced in Iceland, functions as a kind of standardized currency. Its value is measured carefully, its quality inspected. That bolt of fabric isn't just a blanket, it's purchasing power. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Icelanders likely traveled as far as Byzantium, serving as members of the Varangian Guard, the elite unit protecting the Byzantine emperor, while not every farm boy from the West Fjords ended up in Constantinople. Saga references and other sources suggest that adventurous Icelanders were part of this broader Norse diaspora. Picture explaining to your neighbors that you're off to guard an emperor several thousand miles away. Casual trade also carries ideas. Christianity arrives partly through contact with Norway. News of political changes travels by ship. Marriages are arranged across the sea. Icelanders are not just passive recipients. They actively participate in exploration and settlement. You feel the wind shift slightly, bringing with it the imagined scent of salt. It reminds you that the same maritime skill that brought settlers here now keeps the island connected. The sagas preserve stories of daring voyages, not just to Norway, but to Greenland and even further west. Ships departing Iceland in the 10th and 11th centuries push the boundaries of the known world. They follow rumors of land glimpsed on the horizon, of driftwood arriving from unknown shores. That outward pull feels almost inevitable. A society accustomed to risk volcanic eruptions, harsh winters, delicate legal balances, is not easily intimidated by open water. There's humor in this relentless seafaring ambition. That's joke number one. When your homeland is a lava field in the North Atlantic, let's sail into the unknown. Sounds less like recklessness and more like diversification. Yet voyages are perilous. Storms rise quickly. Navigation depends on sun, stars, and memory. A miscalculation can mean weeks lost at sea. Ships are sturdy, but not invincible. When a vessel fails to return, families wait through winter with quiet dread. Historians still argue how frequent and regular these trade voyages truly were during the early Commonwealth period versus later centuries when Norwegian influence deepens. Archaeological evidence suggests sustained contact, but the precise volume of commerce remains debated. You imagine standing on a cliff at sunset, watching a departing ship shrink into the horizon. The sail becomes a pale triangle, then a speck, then nothing. Trust is required, trust in seamanship, in seasonal winds, in the promise that next summer's Althing will include familiar faces returning with stories. Trade doesn't just move goods, it moves reputation. A man who has traveled abroad returns with prestige. He may bring exotic items, tales of foreign courts, perhaps even new fashions and cloak pins. In a society attuned to status, travel enhances identity. At the Althing, these returning voyagers become sources of news. Political shifts in Norway, rumors of new lands, updates on kings and bishops all filter into Icelandic decision-making. The island may lack a king, but it does not lack awareness. The fire at your side flares briefly, as if mimicking a sail catching wind. You realize how interconnected this saga world truly is. Farms in isolated valleys are linked by seasonal gatherings, which are linked by ships to distant shores. And in that network of sea routes and legal recitations, something remarkable forms, a culture confident enough to explore, yet rooted enough to return. You sit quietly, listening to the imagined creak of timbers and the low murmur of traders striking bargains. Beyond the dark outline of Thingvellir's cliffs lies the Atlantic vast, cold, and full of possibility. And as sparks rise into the Icelandic night, you sense that some of those ships are not merely trading, they are heading toward something even more improbable, lands whispered about beyond Greenland, where grapes might grow wild and timber stands thick. But that is a voyage still gathering wind. Imagine you're sitting by a fire, maybe somewhere in Iceland, watching the sparks twist and dance. A stiff wind blows in from an imagined harbor, and through the mist, one ship comes into focus. It cuts through the gray water with such confidence, you just know the man at its helm has never taken no for an answer. That man is Eric the Red, and today we're sailing with him. Eric Thorvaldsson, better known as Eric the Red, absolutely earned his nickname. The Old Norse sagas say it was because of his fiery red hair and beard. But knowing his story, it could just as easily describe his explosive temper. Eric was a real 10th century Norse explorer, and he's credited with founding the first Norse settlements in Greenland around the year 980. That's the solid historical fact we can hang our hats on. But here's the thing. Eric didn't sail off to found a new colony because he was feeling adventurous. He went because he got kicked out of Iceland. It seems to be a bit of a family pattern, actually. His father had to leave Norway for Iceland when King Harald Fairhair started uniting the country. And once in Iceland, Eric got into some trouble. The sagas are full of stories about his feuds over land and property, which ended with a few people dead. As a result, the assembly in Iceland sentenced him to 3 years of exile. He was declared an outlaw. Now, historians still debate whether the sagas exaggerated all this personal drama for a good story, or if Eric really was just that charismatic and combustible. But either way, the sentence was clear. You have to leave. So, what does a recently outlawed Viking do? He gathers a crew, gets on his ship, and sails west into mostly uncharted waters. It wasn't a total shot in the dark. There had been rumors of land west of Iceland. Sailors blown off course had glimpsed distant shores. But Eric was the first one to deliberately go explore it. For the 3 years of his exile, he methodically scouted the southwestern coast of this massive, icy land. When his sentence was up, he sailed back to Iceland with some incredible news, and this is where a true marketing genius enters the story. He called the place Greenland. According to the sagas, Eric himself said he chose the name because, and I quote, "people would be more eager to go there if it had a good name." This might just be one of the earliest examples of optimistic real estate branding in history. A vast island covered in ice and snow. No problem, we'll call it Greenland and hope nobody checks the fine print before they sign up. Now, to be fair, Greenland was probably a bit greener back then. It was the middle of the medieval warm period, which likely made the coastal areas milder and allowed for some limited farming. But let's be real, that name was still doing a lot of heavy lifting. You can just picture Eric standing before the assembly in Iceland after his exile, describing these lush, fertile valleys, perfect for grazing cattle and building a new life. Some people were probably skeptical, but for others, maybe younger sons with no land of their own. His words sparked their imagination. So, around the year 985, Eric led a whole fleet of ships west to colonize his new discovery. It was a dangerous journey. The North Atlantic is unforgiving, and not all of the ships made it, but enough did. They arrived and established 2 main settlements in southwestern: Greenland, the eastern settlement, and the western settlement. They built farms, churches would eventually follow, and soon cattle and sheep were grazing in the narrow fjords. It's an incredible story of expansion. Iceland, which was itself a new colony founded just a century earlier, was now the launching point for an even more ambitious adventure. Eric's personality drives the whole narrative. He's stubborn, he's bold, and probably incredibly frustrating to deal with. He wasn't a gentle visionary, but he was a leader who got things done. For him, being exiled didn't shrink his world, it made it bigger. There's a kind of dark humor to it, isn't there? Get banished from one island. No worries, just go discover a much larger one and start your own community. But Greenland was no paradise. Life was hard. Farming was a constant struggle. They were completely dependent on trade with Europe for essentials like timber and iron. Their main exports were luxury goods like walrus, ivory, and polar bear hides. Isolation was a very real threat. The winters were brutal, and sea ice could block the harbors for months, cutting them off from the rest of the world. The Greenland Norse settlements did eventually vanish in the 15th century, long after Eric's time. Historians still argue about why. It could have been a cooling climate, economic collapse, conflict with the local Inuit populations, or a combination of everything. But in Eric's lifetime, the colony was a resounding success, a testament to his sheer force of will. You can picture him standing outside his farm at Bertali, looking out over the fjord and the mountains. The grass might be thin, but it's there. The air is sharp and clean. It's not an easy land, but then again, neither was Iceland. And here's a fascinating little detail about his personal life. Eric himself apparently resisted converting to Christianity, even as his wife, Jay Hilder, embraced the new faith. She even had a small church built right near their home. Imagine that. domestic religious tension in a frontier settlement at the edge of the known world. It seems even the boldest explorers can't win every argument at home. The story of Eric the Red is a powerful lesson in resilience. For the Vikings, being an outlaw could become an opportunity. A harsh, frozen landscape could become a new home. But Eric's story also sets the stage for something even more incredible, because among the children who grew up in his Greenland colony was his son, a man who would look not just west, but even further west, a man who would sail beyond the horizon and land on a shore that no European had ever seen before. From that valley in Iceland, where law and order first exiled Eric, the threads of history stretched out across the Atlantic, first to Iceland, then to Greenland, and finally, beyond. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into the past, make sure to like and subscribe for more. The sparks from Eric's ambitious fire drift higher, and as they fade into the dark Icelandic sky, you sense another sail-catching wind farther west. If Eric the Red pushes exile into opportunity, his son turns curiosity into legend. You remain by your quiet campfire at Thingvellir, but now your imagination crosses first to Greenland, to the fjords of Brittali, and then beyond. Because here comes Leif Erikson, Leif the Lucky. That nickname alone suggests things go suspiciously well for him. Historically speaking, Leif Erikson is widely credited as the first European to reach North America around the year 1000, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. Archaeological evidence at El Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland confirms the presence of a Norse settlement from this period. That's your firm historical anchor. Norse explorers did reach North America, and Leif is the central figure in the saga tradition describing it. According to the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, Leif hears tales of lands sighted west of Greenland by a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had been blown off course but never went ashore. Leif, being more proactive, buys Bjarni's ship and decides to investigate properly. You can almost hear him saying, "You saw a new continent and just sailed away." So he sets off with a crew, heading west into unknown waters. The sagas describe 3 lands: Helgeland, land of flat stones, often associated with Baffin Island; Markland Forest Land, possibly Labrador; and finally, Vinland. Vinland is the intriguing one. The sagas describe wild grapes growing, there hence the name, often translated as wineland. Historians still argue whether Ving refers to grapes specifically, or more generally, to meadows or pasture. Grapes don't grow naturally as far north as Newfoundland today, though the climate around the year 1000 may have been slightly milder. The debate continues, scholarly and persistent. You picture the moment of landfall. After weeks at sea, a coastline appears rocky forested, different from the stark fjords of Greenland. Trees grow thick and tall, an almost shocking abundance compared to the timber scarcity back home. For Greenlanders used to importing wood, this must feel like stumbling into a hardware store the size of a continent. Here, as your quirky tidbit, the Norse at El Anse aux Meadows appear to have repaired ships and possibly gathered timber and other resources. But there's no evidence they established a long-term, permanent colony. The site seems more like a seasonal base camp than a sprawling settlement. You imagine Leif stepping onto shore, boots sinking into unfamiliar soil. The air smells different, earthier, less sharp. Perhaps there are strange birds calling from the trees. Perhaps the crew looks around with a mixture of awe and mild concern. Because of course they are not alone. The sagas mention encounters with indigenous peoples, referred to as These meetings are initially cautious, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent. The historical details are sparse and filtered through Norse perspective. Historians still argue about the nature and extent of these interactions, and about which indigenous groups the Norse may have encountered. Likely ancestors of the Beothuk or other peoples of the region. The sagas describe trade, red cloth exchanged for animal pelts, but they also describe conflict. At one point, a bull belonging to the Norse reportedly frightens the indigenous people, triggering hostilities. Imagine being responsible for international tension because your livestock lacked diplomatic training. That's joke number 1. History's first transatlantic incident possibly caused by a startled cow. Despite the promise of Vinland, the Norse do not remain long-term. The sagas cite conflict with indigenous groups and the difficulty of sustaining a remote colony as key reasons. Greenland itself is already marginal. Pushing further west stretches resources thin, and yet the achievement is undeniable. Around the year 1000, Norse sailors crossed the North Atlantic and reached North America using navigational skills, sturdy ships, and an appetite for risk. It's one of the great understated milestones in medieval history. Back at your fire in Thingvellir, you think about how matter-of-factly the sagas treat it. There's no triumphant speech about discovering a new world. It's described almost as another chapter in a long sequence of voyages. We found land, it had timber, there were some issues. We left. Saga, understatement strikes again. Leif himself reportedly converts to Christianity during a visit to Norway and brings the new faith back to Greenland, earning another layer of legacy. Explorer, missionary, lucky son of a famously red-headed exile, it's quite a resume. Historians still argue how much of Leif's narrative is shaped by later Christian authors eager to frame him as a bringer of faith as well as an explorer. The sagas were written down centuries after the events they describe, and motives can blur over time. You look up at the dark Icelandic sky and imagine the arc of those voyages Norway to Iceland, Iceland to Greenland, Greenland to Vinland. Each step builds on the last. Each generation pushes slightly further, and yet Vinland does not become a lasting Norse outpost. The sagas preserve it as a place of possibility rather than permanence, a glimpse of another world, briefly touched. The fire beside you settles into a calm, steady glow. You realize that these Western voyages reflect something essential about the saga age, a willingness to test boundaries, even when survival at home is already precarious. From the Larok to distant forests across the ocean, the people of this era move through a world that feels both vast and intimately connected. Their ships stitch together coastlines, their stories stitch together memory. And as embers drift upward like faint glowing sails, you sense that Vinland is less an ending than a symbola, reminder that even from a volcanic island in the North Atlantic, horizons remain open. The Atlantic wind fades from your imagination, and the sound that returns is softer, now less sailcloth, snapping, more the murmur of voices carried across a valley. You're back at Thingvellir, where history isn't made by distant landfalls, but by decisions spoken aloud in open air. It's the year 1000. You sit close enough to the Larok to feel the tension ripple through the crowd. Iceland stands at a crossroads, and no one can sail away from this one. Christianity has been spreading across Scandinavia for decades. Kings in Norway, especially Olaf Tryggvason, have been actively promoting conversions, sometimes with enthusiastic persuasion that includes threats and political pressure. Iceland, though independent, relies heavily on trade with Norway. That trade comes with strings. Some Icelandic chieftains have already converted. Others cling firmly to the old gods Odin, Thor, Freya, whose names echo through poetry and memory. Tension builds, feuds simmer. The island risks splitting into rival religious camps. You can almost feel the social fabric stretching thin. Historically, what happens next is one of the most remarkable peaceful religious transitions in medieval Europe. Rather than descend into civil war, Iceland brings the question to the Althing. The decision is entrusted to the law speaker at the time, a man named Wargeir Leosvetningogo. Like Wargeir, is himself a pagan priest chieftain. That alone makes this moment deliciously complicated. According to the sagas, Wargeir withdraws under a cloak for a full day and night, lying down to contemplate the matter. You imagine him wrapped in wool, staring into darkness, the weight of an entire island pressing down like an extra blanket you didn't ask for. Here, as your quirky tidbit, the image of him literally lying under a cloak to think has become iconic in Icelandic memory. It's basically medieval, Iceland's version of Do Not Disturb. Historians still argue how much of this scene is dramatized in later saga retellings, but the outcome is clear. Wargeir announces that Iceland will adopt Christianity as its official religion to preserve unity. However, he allows certain pagan practices like eating horse meat and private worship of old gods to continue temporarily. It's a compromise, a carefully measured one. You watch the crowd absorb the decision. Some faces show relief, others resignation. A few, perhaps, feel quiet triumph. The key point is that the island does not fracture into religious warfare. That's your mainstream historical fact. Iceland officially converted to Christianity around the year 1000 through a legal decision at the Althing, rather than through violent conquest. You can't help but admire the practicality. Faced with external pressure and internal division, they choose cohesion over purity. It's not dramatic in a sword-clashing way, but it's powerful. And let's be honest, if your options are civil war or collective agreement, after one guy thinks really hard under a blanket. The blanket option feels refreshingly mature. That's joke number 1. After the decision, churches begin to rise across Iceland. Christian burial practices replace pagan ones. Over time, monasteries will become centers of learning. Literacy in Latin spreads. The very sagas you re-drifting through will eventually be written down by Christian scribes in the 12th and 13th centuries. Historians still argue how much pre-Christian belief quietly lingers beneath the surface of later Christian Icelandic culture. Elements of folklore elves, hidden people, land spirits persist stubbornly. Conversion may have been official, but imagination doesn't switch off overnight. You picture the old gods fading slowly, not in a blaze of destruction, but in a kind of cultural twilight. Thor's hammer pendants give way to crosses, yet stories of giants and spirits remain woven into landscape and lore. At Thingvellir, the law rock remains central. The mechanism of law, not force, shapes this transformation. It's a reminder that even in a saga world filled with feuds and exiles, collective governance carries real weight. Meanwhile, Norway's king likely views the outcome with satisfaction. Iceland remains economically tied to Norway, and shared religion strengthens those bonds. Politics and faith intertwine like threads in a wool cloak. You glance at the imaginary wargeyer, finally rising from beneath his contemplative cover. One hopes he stretched first. Making national decisions can cramp the shoulders. That's joke number 2. But beneath the humor lies something genuinely striking. This moment sets the stage for Iceland's intellectual flowering. Christian institutions bring scriptorial places where manuscripts are copied. Without conversion, it's difficult to imagine the preservation of the sagas in written form. So, paradoxically, the decision that sidelines the old gods ensures that their stories survive on parchment. Historians still debate whether this was an intentional act of cultural preservation or simply a byproduct of Christian literary culture. Either way, the result is extraordinary. The myths and genealogies of a pagan past are recorded by Christian hands. The fire beside you burns lower. Its light softer now. You sense that something has shifted in the earnod, a sudden break, but a gradual recalibration. Iceland has chosen unity over fragmentation, law over violence, compromise over purity. It's not flashy, it doesn't involve discovering new continents, but it shapes everything that follows. From this point on, the sagas will be written in a Christian Iceland, remembering a pagan past. The tension between those layers will give them depth, complexity, and that slightly wistful tone you've been feeling all along. You settle more comfortably on the cool ground, listening to the quiet murmur of imagined voices fading into night. Change has come not with thunder, but with a man under a cloak deciding that survival matters more than stubbornness. The decision at Thingvellir settles into memory like ash into soil, and as Christianity spreads across Iceland, something quieter begins to happen. The swords don't vanish, the feuds don't evaporate, but alongside them, another force takes root. Ink. You remain by the campfire, but now the glow feels more like lamplight in a turf-walled room. Outside, wind scrapes across grass and lava rock. Inside, someone bends over stretched calfskin, carefully forming letters with a quill. You can almost smell the faint tang of parchment and smoke. By the 12th and especially the 13th century, Iceland becomes astonishingly literate for a medieval society. Monasteries and ecclesiastical centers foster learning. Latin is studied but alongside religious texts. Something remarkable happens. Icelanders begin writing down their own stories in the vernacular. This is your mainstream historical fact, the Icelandic Sagas family sagas. King sagas, legendary sagas are, largely written down in the 1200s, even though they describe events from the 9th to 11th centuries. You might expect a neat official chronicle. Instead, what you get are layered narratives filled with flawed heroes, simmering grudges, sharp dialogue, and an almost cinematic sense of tension. One name rises prominently in this literary flowering, Snorri Sturluson. Snorri is a chieftain, poet, historian, and political operator all at once. He writes the prose Edda, preserving Norse mythology, and composes Heimskringla, a sweeping history of Norwegian kings. You imagine Snorri, seated at a long table, candle flickering, dictating lines that will outlive empires. He preserved stories of Odin and Thor not as objects of worship, but as cultural memory. Without him and others like him, much of Norse mythology would be lost. Here, your quirky tidbit, Snorri Espro's EDA may have partly functioned as a textbook for aspiring poets, explaining complex mythological references so they could craft proper skaldic verse. It's like a medieval creative writing manual, except your metaphors must involve frost giants. Historians still argue whether the sagas reflect faithful oral tradition or whether 13th century authors shaped them to comment on their own turbulent times. The sagas were written during the Stirling Age, a period of intense internal conflict in Iceland. It's possible that authors projected contemporary anxieties backward into earlier centuries. So when you read about simmering feuds in the 10th century, you might also be glimpsing 13th century tensions in disguise. You lean closer to the fire and imagine how stories were told before they were written. In longhouses during winter, with storms howling outside, families would recount genealogies, heroic deeds, bitter betrayals. Memory becomes performance. Performance becomes identity. And then, one day, someone decides to fix those stories in ink. It's a strange transformation. Oral tradition is fluid. Written text feels solid, but even the written sagas are not fixed in the way modern books are. Manuscripts vary, scribes copy, adapt, occasionally embellish. Margins fill with notes. Picture a scribe pausing mid-sentence because a sheep wandered into the room. Medieval multitasking at its finest. That's joke number 1. Yet the discipline is real. Calfskin parchment is expensive. Ink must be mixed. Writing is labor. These manuscripts are treasured objects. Historians still debate the authorship of many sagas. Most are anonymous. Was Angela's saga written by a cleric, a chieftain? A legally trained mind fascinated by courtroom drama? We don't know, and that uncertainty adds to the mystique. You can almost feel the dual identity forming. Iceland as both warrior society and literary powerhouse. Few medieval cultures produce such detailed prose narratives about their own past, and there's something stylistically distinctive about the sagas. The tone is often spare, understated. Emotional explosions are described in calm sentences. A man might announce his intention to kill someone with the same tone you'd use to discuss weather. Fine weather today. Yes, also, I will avenge my brother. That's joke number 2. But the restraint makes the moments of violence or betrayal more powerful. The sagas trust you to feel the weight beneath the words. Christianity shapes this literary culture, yet pagan memory saturates it. The old gods appear as characters in mythological texts. Fate word, or its Norse equivalent, hovers over family sagas. Dreams and omens punctuate key moments. Historians still argue whether saga authors believed in these supernatural elements or treated them as literary devices. Either way, they weave them seamlessly into otherwise realistic narratives. You sit at Thingvellir and realize the campfire itself becomes symbolic. Around fires, stories are told. In monasteries, they are written. In manuscripts, they travel across centuries. The sagas preserve not just events, but atmosphere, legal procedures, farm life, marriage negotiations, insult etiquette. Yes, insult etiquette. There is an art to calling someone a coward in Old Norse society, and it can be legally actionable. That's joke number 3. Imagine suing someone because their insult was too poetically devastating. But in truth, words carry immense weight in this culture. Reputation is currency. Memory is power. As the fire crackles softly, you sense how fragile this preservation is. Parchment can burn, manuscripts can decay, political shifts can silence traditions, and yet somehow these texts endure. You sit in the valley where laws were spoken aloud, and you imagine those same words, centuries later, inscribed with care. Oral law becomes written history. Pagan myth becomes literary heritage. Feud becomes narrative structure. The sparks rise slowly now, less frantic than before. Ink dries, stories settle. In a world carved by lava and ice, Iceland has discovered another tool for survival, storytelling that refuses to fade. The ink dries, but the tempers don't. You remain in the 13th century now, and the glow of monastic lamps feels thinner than the flare of political ambition. The sagas are being written even as Iceland itself begins to fracture under the weight of competing chieftains. It's almost poetic stories about feuds preserved, while new feuds erupt outside the scriptorium doors. This is the Stirling Age, named after one particularly powerful and complicated family, the Stirlings. And right at the center of it all stands that literary multitasker you met earlier, Snorri Sturluson, not just as an author now, but as a political actor. By the early 1200s, Iceland's Commonwealth system is under strain. The old balance of relatively independent chieftains, loosely coordinated through the Althing, begins to wobble. Wealth concentrates in fewer hands. Alliances harden. Ambition sharpens. Historically, this period from roughly 1220 to 1262 is marked by escalating internal conflict among powerful families. That's your mainstream anchor. The Stirling era is a time of near civil war in Iceland. You picture yourself standing again at Thingvellir, but the atmosphere is different. The air feels tight, negotiations are less about compromise and more about leverage. Snorri himself becomes entangled in Norwegian politics. He aligns with Håkon IV, accepting titles in favor. Norway, once merely a trade partner and religious influence, now casts a longer political shadow. Iceland's independence begins to look precarious. Historians still argue whether Snorri genuinely sought Norwegian overlordship for Iceland or simply maneuvered for personal advantage. Motives blur. Was he a pragmatist, an opportunist, a reluctant intermediary? You imagine him trying to juggle poetry, property disputes, royal promises, and family rivalries all at once. Medieval calendar management must have been exhausting. That's joke number 1. Forget modern email overload. Try balancing feuds with 3 cousins and a foreign king. Conflict intensifies. Rival chieftains gather armed followers. Battles break out in not massive continental clashes, but brutal, decisive engagements that leave deep scars in a small society. Farms are burned, alliances shift, trust erodes. One particularly famous confrontation is the Battle of Grigsdair in 1238, where hundreds of men fight and dozens are killed. For Iceland, with its small population, this is catastrophic. You feel the weight of it, the realization that this isn't distant myth, but neighbors fighting neighbors. Historians still debate how widespread violence truly was compared to saga dramatization. The sources emphasize key battles, but everyday tensions may have been just as corrosive. Meanwhile, Norway watches King Håkon IV seeks to extend his influence over Iceland. Divided leadership makes that easier. The old Commonwealth system based on consensus and law rather than monarchized struggles under concentrated power and foreign pressure. And then comes a stark turning point. In 1241, Snorri Sturluson is assassinated in his own cellar at Reykholt. According to tradition, his last words are said to be, "Do not strike." A chilling understatement worthy of saga style. The order to kill him likely traces back to Norwegian authority, though carried out by Icelandic rivals. That's your grim historical fact, kept PG-13 but heavy nonetheless. One of Iceland's greatest literary figures dies in political violence. You pause by the fire and feel the shift. The man who preserved myths and kings' histories cannot escape the turbulence of his own time. Here, as your quirky tidbit, Snorri's home at Reykholt included an early geothermal heating system, hot water channeled through stone pipes into a bathhouse, political intrigue and spa day in one location. Medieval Iceland knew how to multitask. That's joke number 2. By 1262 to 1264, exhausted by conflict, Icelandic chieftains accept the Old Covenant, formally submitting to the Norwegian crown. The Commonwealth ends. Iceland becomes a territory under Norwegian rule. It's not a dramatic conquest with siege towers and flaming arrows. It's more like a weary exhale. After decades of infighting, external authority feels stabilizing. Historians still argue whether this submission was inevitable due to economic dependence and internal fragmentation, or whether stronger unity might have preserved independence longer. Counterfactuals swirl like sparks in the dark. You imagine the law rock again, but now its authority feels altered. Laws will still be recited, assemblies will still meet, yet ultimate sovereignty no longer rests solely here. The sagas being written during this time reflect tension between autonomy and hierarchy. They often portray strong-willed individuals navigating systems of law, honor, and fate. Perhaps that mirrors the writer's own uncertain world. You realize something quietly poignant. The golden age of saga writing overlaps with the twilight of political independence. As if sensing change, Iceland pours its identity into manuscripts. That's joke number 3, softly delivered. When in doubt, write it down before someone else governs it. The fire beside you burns lower now, not in defeat, but in steady endurance. Iceland will not vanish. It will adapt under Norwegian, and later Danish, rule. Its language will remain remarkably stable. Its stories will survive. But in this moment, during the Sterling Age, you feel the ache of internal fracture. The same society that once chose unity under a cloak to avoid religious war cannot entirely avoid political ambition. You sit quietly at Thingvellir, hearing echoes of debate, steel, poetry, and whispered conspiracies blending into the night air. Ink and blood have both marked this land, and as the sparks rise fewer now, but persistent, you sense that Iceland's story is shifting from expansion to endurance. The sparks drift upward, thinner now, as if the island itself is adjusting to a new gravity. You remain at Thingvellir, but the tone has shifted. The Commonwealth is over. Iceland has accepted the authority of the Norwegian crown. Independence, once so fiercely guarded, now bends into something more complicated. By the mid-13th century, following the Old Covenant agreements between 1262 and 1264, Iceland formally becomes subject to the King of Norway. That's your solid historical anchor. The Althing continues to function, but ultimate sovereignty no longer resides solely in this valley. You imagine messengers arriving by ship, bearing royal decrees stamped with unfamiliar seals. Instead of chieftains negotiating solely among themselves, royal officials here Sanjor and Sanslumen begin to represent Norwegian interests. Power becomes more vertical, less horizontal. At first, perhaps it feels stabilizing. The decades of sterling conflict have exhausted everyone. External authority promises order. Trade networks remain intact. Law persists, even if it answers to a distant king. Historians still argue whether Iceland's submission was primarily driven by internal fatigue, economic dependency on Norway, or strategic pressure from King Hakon IV. Likely it's all three, braided together like rope on a longship deck. You picture farmers in remote fjords reacting with pragmatic shrugs. As long as the sheep survive winter, someone mutters, the king can sit wherever he likes. Medieval priorities, warmth, food, relative peace. That's joke number one. But Norway's hold doesn't remain static. In 1380, a dynastic union joins Norway and Denmark under one crown. Through inheritance and political maneuvering, Iceland becomes part of a broader Scandinavian framework under Danish influence. By the late Middle Ages, effective authority over Iceland rests increasingly in Copenhagen. Enter the Kalmar Union in 1397, uniting Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under a single monarch. While Iceland isn't a negotiating partner in that union, it's certainly included in the package. Here's your quirky tidbit. For many Icelanders, the distant monarch might as well have been a mythic figure. Communication takes weeks or months by sea. Royal power feels abstract compared to the immediacy of weather and livestock. Yet policy matters. Trade restrictions tighten over time. By the 17th century, Denmark establishes a trade monopoly over Iceland, limiting who Icelanders can trade with and under what conditions. The centuries under distant crowns settle over the island like a long winter interval, sometimes harsh, occasionally bright, with small mercies. You remain at Thingvellir, but now the wind feels colder, more brittle, as the 18th century approaches with a reminder that nature, not kings, often dictates the harshest terms. In 1783, the earth itself splits open. You imagine a tremor beneath your feet, a low rumble that grows into something unignorable. Far to the southeast, a volcanic fissure erupts in what will be known as the Laki eruption, technically the Lakajigar fissure system. For 8 months, fountains of lava pour across the landscape. Toxic gases drift across Iceland and beyond. This is your firm historical anchor. The Laki eruption of 1783 to 1784 is one of the largest volcanic events in recorded history, releasing vast amounts of sulfur dioxide and causing widespread environmental catastrophe. You picture ash falling like gray snow. Livestock sicken from fluorine poisoning in the grass. Crops fail. Famine follows. It's estimated that around a quarter of Iceland's population dies in the aftermath. A staggering loss for such a small society, and the impact doesn't stop at Iceland's shores. The volcanic haze spreads across Europe, contributing to unusual weather patterns. Some historians link the climatic disruptions of the 1780s partly to Laki's eruption. Though historians still argue how directly it influenced later events, like the social tensions preceding the French Revolution. Volcano, as geopolitical mood setter, not exactly subtle. Here's your quirky tidbit. Contemporary accounts describe a dry fog hanging over Europe, dimming the sun and creating eerie red sunsets. Imagine 18th century Londoners squinting at the sky, unaware that a fissure in Iceland is painting their horizon. That's joke number 1, gently delivered. Iceland didn't just export fish hit, briefly exported atmospheric drama. Back at Thingvellir, you sense how small human politics seem in comparison to molten rock. Danish trade monopolies and administrative reforms matter. Yes, but lava does not consult policy. The Danish crown attempts reforms in the late 18th century. The trade monopoly, which had restricted Icelandic commerce for centuries, is abolished in 1786. New towns are chartered to encourage economic development. Enlightenment ideas filter northward. Historians still argue how transformative these reforms truly were. Did they meaningfully modernize Iceland's economy, or were they limited gestures within persistent structural constraints? You imagine cautious optimism flickering alongside grief. After famine, after loss, even small openings feel significant. As the 19th century dawns, winds of nationalism sweep across Europe. Ideas about self-determination and cultural identity gain momentum. Iceland, with its preserved language and rich saga heritage, begins to look at itself differently. Enter a new kind of hero, not a sword-wielding explorer, but a scholar and political thinker, Jóhann Sigurðsson. Jóhann Sigurðsson becomes the leading voice of Icelandic nationalism in the 19th century. Educated, articulate, deeply rooted in Icelandic history, he argues for greater autonomy from Denmark. He draws on the island's medieval commonwealth as evidence of a historic right to self-governance. You imagine him invoking Thingvellir not just as a scenic valley, but as a symbol of constitutional tradition. The past becomes political leverage. Historians still debate how much medieval Iceland truly functioned as a democratic ideal versus an oligarchic network of chieftains. But symbolism matters. The Althing, even under foreign rule, remains a powerful emblem. In 1845, the Althing is re-established as a consultative assembly after having been dissolved as a national parliament in 1800 and functioning merely as a court. That's your mainstream fact of political revival. The Althing returns in a new form, signaling renewed national consciousness. You picture debates once again echoing in this valley, though now framed by modern constitutional language rather than saga honor codes. That's joke number 2. Fewer axes, more paperwork. The 19th century also brings economic hardship and waves of emigration. Many Icelanders leave for North America, particularly Canada and the United States, seeking opportunity and relief from poverty. Harsh weather, limited farmland, and volcanic instability make life precarious. Yet cultural identity strengthens. The Icelandic language remains central. Romantic nationalism celebrates the sagas, the landscape, the idea of a resilient people shaped by fire and ice. Historians still argue whether Icelandic nationalism was primarily elite driven led by educated figures like Jóhann Sigurðsson, broadly rooted in popular sentiment. Likely it evolved from both currents, intertwining like threads in homespun wool. You sit by the fire and feel the shift from survival to aspiration. For centuries, endurance defined Iceland's relationship to foreign rule and natural disaster. Now, memory becomes motivation. Thingvellir, once the site of legal compromise, and later a symbol under foreign sovereignty, transforms into a stage for national identity. In 1874, Denmark grants Iceland its first constitution, providing limited home rule within the Danish realm. It's a step not full independence, but movement. That's joke number 3, softly murmured. After centuries of lava, famine, and monopolies, paperwork finally begins to erupt. The fire before you steadies. The air feels less brittle now, tinged with cautious hope. Iceland is still under Danish rule, but its voice grows clearer. Volcanoes may split the earth. Epidemics may thin the population. Monarchs may sign decrees in distant capitals, but language persists, memory persists. And in this valley, the idea of self-governance once lived, then remembered, begins to breathe again. The sparks drift upward, not as scattered embers, but as steady signals in the night. The sparks lift in a calmer rhythm now, and the air around you feels less like survival and more like anticipation. You remain at Thingvellir, but it's no longer just a memory-laden valley, it's becoming a national stage. The 19th century rolls forward with deliberate patience. After the 1874 Constitution grants Iceland limited self-rule within the Danish kingdom, political consciousness sharpens, debates grow more specific. Autonomy is no longer a poetic ideal. It's an administrative project. You picture lawmakers drafting proposals by lamplight, their desks stacked not with swords but with documents. Ink, once used to preserve sagas, now outlines budgets and legal codes. In 1904, Iceland achieves home rule. Executive power transfers from Copenhagen to Reykjavik, and a minister for Icelandic affairs residing in Iceland is appointed. That's your solid historical anchor. Home rule marks a major step toward practical self-governance. You can almost feel the psychological shift. Authority moves physically closer. Decisions no longer require weeks of sea travel to reach the king's desk. Reykjavik, once a modest trading town founded in the 18th century, grows in significance. Historians still argue whether home rule fundamentally transformed daily life for ordinary Icelanders or primarily empowered political elites. Structural change often moves slower than headlines, but the trajectory is clear. The conversation has shifted from "should we govern ourselves" to "how do we govern ourselves effectively?" Here's your quirky tidbit. During this era, Icelandic nationalists leaned heavily on medieval imagery invoking saga heroes and the Old Commonwealth, while simultaneously advocating for modern parliamentary structures. It's like quoting Viking poetry in a constitutional law seminar. That's joke number one. Nothing spices up bureaucratic reform like a well-timed reference to The early 20th century brings both promise and turbulence. Fishing motorized vessels expand economic potential. Urbanization slowly increases. Reykjavik grows from a small settlement into a more complex town with schools, newspapers, and civic institutions. Then the wider world intrudes. World War I disrupts trade routes and strains Iceland's economy, even though Iceland itself is not a battlefield. Dependence on foreign shipping highlights vulnerability. Economic hardship resurfaces, reminding everyone that geography still shapes destiny. Historians still debate how deeply World War I altered Icelandic society compared to continental Europe. While the scale of devastation is incomparable, economic shock and political recalibration leave lasting marks. And then comes 1918. On December 1st, 1918, the Act of Union recognizes Iceland as a sovereign state in personal union with the Danish king. That's your mainstream milestone. Iceland becomes officially sovereign, though it still shares a monarch with Denmark. You imagine church bells ringing in Reykjavik, flags unfurling in cold winter air. It's not full republic status yet, but it's unmistakable progress. Under the Act of Union, Iceland controls its domestic affairs, while Denmark manages foreign relations and defense. The agreement is set to be revisited after 25 years. Historians still argue whether this arrangement represented cautious pragmatism or lingering dependency. But sovereignty, even partial, feels transformative. Back at Thingvellir, you sense the valley reclaiming its symbolic authority. The place where law once unified pagans and Christians now stands as a reminder of constitutional continuity. That's joke number two, gently delivered. Iceland's political development is basically a very long saga with unusually patient character growth. The interwar years bring both optimism and economic strain. The global Great Depression hits Iceland hard in the 1930s, especially given its reliance on fish exports. Economic instability fuels political movements across Europe, and Iceland is not immune to ideological debates. Yet democratic institutions hold, parliamentary governance continues. The Althing remains central. Then comes World War II. In April 1940, Nazi Germany occupies Denmark. Suddenly, Iceland's link to its sovereign partner is severed. With Denmark unable to manage Iceland's foreign affairs or defense, the island stands exposed in the North Atlantic. You imagine tension humming through Reykjavik's harbor. Strategic importance becomes undeniable. In May 1940, British forces occupy Iceland to prevent German control. Later, American forces assume responsibility for defense. That's your firm historical fact. During World War II, Iceland is occupied first by Britain, and then by the United States. Despite its declared neutrality, historians still argue whether the occupation accelerated Iceland's modernization or disrupted its cultural rhythm. The presence of foreign troops brings infrastructure development roads, airfields, but also social tension. Here, as your quirky tidbit, the sudden arrival of thousands of foreign soldiers dramatically alters Iceland's demographics and daily life. Local slang even coins the term astandi, referring to the situation of relationships. Between Icelandic women and Allied soldiers, social change arrives faster than anyone expected. That's joke number 3, softly phrased, when your population is small. Even one extra shipload of people feels like a major plot twist. With Denmark still under occupation, Iceland holds a referendum in 1944 on whether to dissolve the Union and establish a republic. The vote is overwhelmingly in favor. On June 17, 1944, deliberately chosen as the birthday of Jahan Sigurðsson, Iceland formally declares itself a republic at Thingvellir. You imagine standing in this very valley, now filled with celebration rather than compromise or conflict. Flags ripple, speeches echo. The long arc from Commonwealth to foreign rule to sovereign republic completes another term. Historians still debate how much World War II urgency influenced the timing versus long-standing nationalist aspirations. But the symbolism is undeniable. The fire beside you burns brighter now, as if reflecting that moment. From saga, age to republic, from law rock to constitution, Iceland has navigated exile, eruption, occupation, and negotiation. You sit quietly, aware that the valley beneath you has witnessed more than a millennium of transformation. The sparks rise, steady and sure. The story continues not as a distant echo of kings, but as a living republic beneath northern stars. The cheers of 1944 fade into a softer hum, like wind settling after a storm. You're still at Thingvellir, but now the valley feels less like a battleground of ideas and more like the quiet foundation of a young republic. Stretching its limbs, Iceland is officially a republic as of June 17, 1944. Denmark is still occupied by Germany at the time, so the break is both symbolic and practical. A new president is elected Zetin Björnsson, marking the first time. Iceland has a head of state who is not a foreign monarch. That's your firm historical anchor. Iceland becomes a fully independent republic in 1944. With its own president, you imagine the cautious optimism. Independence is no longer theoretical. It's administrative, diplomatic, very real. Yet the island remains deeply entangled with global currents. World War II hasn't ended. Allied forces are still stationed here. Airfields built by foreign troops reshape the landscape. Historians still argue whether the wartime occupation should be remembered primarily as a violation of neutrality or as a catalyst for modernization. Both interpretations have weight. Infrastructure expands, roads improve, the economy diversifies. Reykjavik, once a modest town, grows rapidly in the post-war years. Concrete replaces turf, electricity spreads. Fishing remains central, but technology transforms it. Trawlers become more efficient. Processing plants expand, and then, in 1949, Iceland makes another decisive choice. It joins NATO. You pause, sensing the complexity. NATO membership places Iceland firmly within the Western Alliance during the Cold War. Yet Iceland has no standing army. Its defense is handled primarily through agreements with the United States, including the continued presence of a U.S. military base at Keflavik. That's your mainstream geopolitical fact. Iceland joins NATO in 1949 despite domestic controversy and without maintaining its own military. Historians still debate how deeply NATO membership aligned with popular sentiment at the time. Protests erupted in Reykjavik when the decision was made. The Cold War feels far away geographically, but strategically. Iceland sits in the middle of the North Atlantica key corridor between North America and Europe. Here, as your quirky tidbit, Iceland remains one of the only NATO members without a standing army. Defense is outsourced, you might say. It's like being in a group project where you handle logistics and let someone else carry the heavy equipment. That's joke number 1. The Cold War years hum quietly but persistently. American military presence brings economic benefits and cultural influence. English words seep into everyday speech. American music plays on radios. Coca-Cola becomes as recognizable as dried fish. Historians still argue whether this cultural infusion diluted Icelandic identity or simply layered onto it. The Icelandic language continues to be protected deliberately, with new words coined rather than borrowed whenever possible. You imagine a committee earnestly inventing Icelandic terms for modern inventions instead of defaulting to English. Linguistic independence becomes a point of pride. Meanwhile, the fishing industry drives the economy, and fishing rights ignite one of the most distinctive diplomatic conflicts in Iceland's modern history. The Cod Wars between 1958 and 1976. Iceland engages in a series of disputes with the United Kingdom over fishing limits in the North Atlantic. Iceland gradually extends its exclusive fishing zone from 4 nautical miles to 200 nautical miles. The UK resists, leading to tense standoffs at sea. This is your solid historical anchor of maritime tension. The Cod Wars reshape international maritime law and secure Iceland's control over vast fishing grounds. No full-scale war erupts, but there are confrontations. Icelandic Coast Guard vessels cut the nets of British trawlers. British naval ships escort their fishing fleets. Diplomacy strains. NATO allies glare at each other awkwardly across icy waves. Historians still debate how much Iceland's strategic NATO position strengthened its negotiating power during the Cod Wars. It's hard to ignore geography when submarines and shipping lanes matter so much. That's joke number 2. When your main export is fish, you defend it like treasure. The eventual outcome favors Iceland. By 1976, the 200-mile exclusive economic zone is recognized, securing control over crucial fishing stocks. For a small nation, it's a major assertion of sovereignty. Back at Thingvellir, you sense pride woven into the wind. Independence isn't just constitutional, it's economic, maritime, practical. The late 20th century brings continued modernization. Education expands, healthcare improves. Hydroelectric and geothermal energy projects harness Iceland's abundant natural resources. Instead of fearing volcanic heat, the country increasingly uses it to warm homes and power industry. Here, your quirky geothermal tidbit, Reykjavik. Swimming pools are famously heated year-round by geothermal water, making outdoor winter swims surprisingly pleasant. Imagine discussing fiscal policy while floating in naturally heated water under falling snow. That is joke number 3. Few parliaments can claim proximity to a volcano and a hot tub. Historians still argue how uniquely Iceland balanced rapid modernization with cultural preservation. Urban life grows, yet rural traditions persist. The Sagas remain part of school curricula. Thingvellir is designated a national park in 1930, long before independence, reinforcing its symbolic centrality. You sit quietly now, watching the fire burn steady and low. The 20th century has not been free of tension Cold War pressures, economic fluctuations, cultural shifts, but Iceland navigates them with a mixture of pragmatism and stubborn self-definition. From Viking voyages to NATO negotiations, from pagan assemblies to parliamentary debates, the island adapts. The sparks drift upward into a sky no longer lit by distant warplanes, but by steady stars. You feel the republic settling into itself, strategic, resilient. The story isn't finished. It never is. But here, in this valley, it feels balanced, rooted in law, shaped by lava, and carried forward by people who have learned again and again how to endure. The fire burns lower now, steady and confident, like a country that has weathered enough storms to trust its footing. You remain at Thingvellir, but the world around Iceland is accelerating. The Cold War hum softens toward its end, and the late 20th century ushers in something less dramatic than cod confrontations, yet no less transformative: globalization. By the 1980s and 1990s, Iceland is no longer a remote outpost clinging to fishing quotas. It's increasingly connected financially, technologically, culturally. Reykjavik grows sleeker. Glass buildings reflect northern light. Universities expand. International travel becomes common. In 1994, Iceland joins the European Economic Area, EEA, gaining access to the European single market while remaining outside the European Union. That's your firm historical anchor. Iceland integrates economically with Europe without fully surrendering regulatory sovereignty. Historians still argue whether this halfway position represents savvy pragmatism or cautious hesitation. Full EU membership remains debated to this day, occasionally flaring into political conversation like a dormant volcano clearing its throat. Meanwhile, the 1990s bring financial liberalization. Icelandic banks expand aggressively. Deregulation opens doors to international borrowing and investment. Young financiers speak confidently about global markets. For a while, it feels like Iceland has leaped from fishing nets to high finance in a single generation. You imagine Reykjavik cafes buzzing with optimism, laptops open, conversations peppered with words like derivatives and leverage. It's a far cry from Sagara barter. That's joke number one. From walrus ivory to complex financial instruments, progress is a wild ride. Then comes 2008. The global financial crisis hits Iceland with particular ferocity. Its three largest banks, Glitnir, Landsbanki, and Kaupthing collapse under the weight of massive foreign debt. The scale is staggering relative to the country's size. Within days, Iceland's banking system essentially This is your undeniable historical fact. In October 2008, Iceland experiences one of the most dramatic banking collapses in modern history. You picture shock rippling through Reykjavik, currency plummeting, savings evaporating, protesters gathering outside parliament with pots and pans, banging rhythmically in what becomes known as the kitchenware revolution. Historians still argue how much of the crisis stemmed from global financial contagion versus uniquely Icelandic overextension and regulatory weakness. Likely both currents converged, the image of citizens clattering cookware outside Alþingi Parlamentist striking. Not violent upheaval, but loud insistence. Democratic pressure, government resignations follow. Reforms begin. Here, your quirky tidbit, Iceland conducts high-profile prosecutions of several bankers and financial executives in the aftermath. Unusual move compared to many other countries affected by the crisis. Accountability becomes part of national recovery. That's joke number two. When you're a small country, it's harder for anyone to quietly disappear into the corporate fog. Recovery is slow but real. Capital controls stabilize the currency. Tourism begins to surge in the 2010s, unexpectedly becoming a major economic pillar. Visitors flock to see glaciers, geysers, black sand beaches, and Thingvellir itself, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You imagine travelers standing where you sit, snapping photos of the Rift Valley where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates visibly drift apart. Geological drama meets Instagram. Historians still debate whether the tourism boom strengthens economic resilience or creates new vulnerabilities. Dependency shifts from fish to finance to visitors with cameras. Meanwhile, Iceland gains global attention for social progress. In Íþjóðaling, Vigdis Finnbogadóttir becomes the world's first woman, elected as a head of state in a national election. That milestone predates the financial crisis by decades, but resonates more widely as Iceland's modern identity crystallizes. Gender equality becomes a point of national pride. Policies evolve. Representation grows. In Arlingling, Johanna Sigurðardóttir becomes one of the world's first openly gay heads of government. That's your mainstream fact of progressive politics. Iceland frequently ranks high in global gender equality indices and has broken notable leadership barriers. You can almost sense the continuity. From law spoken at the Law Rock to modern legislative reforms, governance remains central to Icelandic self-definition. That's joke number three, gently offered. When your country is small enough to fit into a group chat, political accountability feels personal. The American military base at Keflavik closes in 2006, symbolizing the end of a long Cold War chapter. Yet NATO membership remains. Iceland continues to balance strategic alliances with domestic priorities. Nature, ever dramatic, reminds everyone who's truly in charge. In 2010, the eruption of Eyjafjallajökull sends ash clouds across Europe, grounding flights for days. Once again, Iceland influences the continent, this time via aviation disruption rather than sulfur haze. Historians still argue whether such eruptions significantly reshape long-term economic patterns or merely create temporary spectacle. But for a few weeks, the world practices pronouncing Eyjafjallajökull with varying degrees of success. You sit quietly by the fire, watching embers pulse. From Viking sails to financial derivatives, from cod nets to capital controls, Iceland's modern story is one of rapid pivots. Small population, outsized headlines, and yet beneath it all, language remains. Sagas are still read. Children still learn about Eric the Red and Leif Erikson. Thingvellir still anchors national ceremonies. The sparks drift upward, carried by a wind that has witnessed lava, law, and leverage. The Republic, bruised but unbroken, continues. And you remain here, Steady in the valley where tectonic plates part slowly, reminded that even dramatic fractures can shape something enduring. The embers settle into a patient glow, and the night feels wide and quiet above Thingvellir. The modern world hums softly in the distant fiber optic cables beneath the sea. Nice satellites overhead, but here, you can still hear the faint murmur of history layered like sediment in the rock. Iceland in the 21st century is small in population, just under 400,000 people, yet disproportionately visible. After the 2008 financial collapse, recovery reshapes the economy in unexpected ways. Tourism surges dramatically through the 2010s, becoming one of the country's largest industries. You picture rental cars lining up near Keflavik, visitors wrapped in parkas, whispering at geysers and hiking across moss-covered lava fields. Thingvellir itself becomes a pilgrimage site not only for Icelanders, but for travelers seeking tectonic novelty. One foot in North America, one in Europe. That's your firm contemporary fact. Tourism becomes a cornerstone of Iceland's post-crisis recovery. Historians and economists still argue whether this heavy reliance on tourism creates economic vulnerability, similar to past overdependence on fishing or finance. Diversification remains a recurring challenge in a small, resource-limited economy. Meanwhile, renewable energy becomes a defining strength. Nearly all of Iceland's electricity is generated from renewable source, is primarily hydroelectric and geothermal power. Homes are heated with naturally hot water drawn from beneath the earth. You imagine winter darkness outside and warm floors beneath your feet, heated by volcanic energy that once terrified settlers. It's a poetic reversal lava as utility provider. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Icelandic greenhouses grow bananas using geothermal heat. Bananas in the North Atlantic, not exactly what Eric the Red had in mind when he branded Greenland. That's joke number 1. Technological connectivity deepens. Iceland becomes a location for data centers, attracted by cool climate and renewable energy. The same cold air that once threatened survival now cools server farms, storing digital memory. Historians of technology still debate how small nations like Iceland leverage geography into digital advantage. Is this the next longship data traveling invisibly across oceans? Culturally, Iceland maintains a careful balance between global influence and linguistic preservation. The Icelandic Language Council actively coins new words to avoid excessive borrowing from English. Smartphones and social media exist, of course, but the language remains remarkably conservative. You picture teenagers texting in Old Norse's modern descendant, casually preserving a millennium of continuity. That's joke number 2. Few countries can claim their autocorrect understands medieval grammar. Politically, Iceland continues to function as a parliamentary republic, with coalition governments that require negotiation and compromise. With a small electorate, political accountability feels immediate. Scandals resonate quickly. Reforms often follow. In 2016, the Panama Papers leak implicates Iceland's prime minister in offshore financial dealings, prompting public protests and his resignation. It's a reminder that transparency remains a civic expectation. Historians still argue whether Iceland's relatively swift political consequences reflect its small size, strong civic culture, or lessons learned from the 2008 crisis. Likely, all three intertwine. Socially, Iceland frequently ranks high in measures of gender equality, education, and overall life satisfaction. Parental leave policies are generous. Women's participation in politics and business is robust. You feel continuity again law and governance as central pillars from the law rock to modern parliamentary chambers. Nature, though, never retires. Glaciers slowly retreat under climate change. Scientists monitor ice caps that have endured since the last ice. Age, new volcanic eruptions periodically capture global attention, especially in the Rockjanes Peninsula in the early 2020s. You imagine fresh lava glowing against dark night skies. Not catastrophic, but mesmerizing. Icelanders watch calmly, accustomed to Earth's restlessness. Historians and climate scientists still argue about how best to interpret the pace of glacial loss in Iceland compared to global patterns. But the visual evidence is hard to ignore as thinning. Landscapes shifting. That's joke number 3. Softly delivered, in Iceland, even climate change comes with dramatic scenery. Tourism, finance, renewable energy, fishing, they all coexist now in a delicate economic choreography. The island remains strategic within NATO, though without a standing army. It remains culturally distinct while globally connected. You sit by the fire at Thingvellir and consider how the narrative arc feels almost circular. The Alhingi still meets, though now in Reykjavik. The valley remains a national symbol. The language still echoes saga cadences. Children still learn about Leif Erikson crossing to Vinland. Scholars still parse Snorri Sturluson's prose. Historians still argue about motives, meanings, and turning points. And through it all, the tectonic plates continue their slow, silent drift beneath you North America, edging westward, Eurasia inching east. A visible rift runs through the valley, a geological metaphor too perfect to ignore. Division and unity, separation and connection. From outlawed explorers to independent republic, from volcanic famine to geothermal abundance, from handwritten sagas to digital archives cooled by Arctic air. The fire is low now, but steady. You feel the weight of centuries compress into this quiet moment. Law spoken aloud, ink pressed into parchment, steam rising from fissures, protesters clattering pots, tourists whispering at rift lines. Iceland remains small, yes, but its story has never been. The sparks lift gently into the northern night, drifting upward like memories that refuse to fade. The night deepens, and the fire shrinks to a bed of glowing coals, steady and unhurried. You remain seated at Thingvellir, but now your attention shifts from events to something quieter. Identity, not the headlines, not the eruptions, but the subtle thread that ties Sagas settlers to smartphone-era citizens. Language is the first thread you notice. Modern Icelandic is astonishingly close to Old Norse. School children today can read medieval sagas with guidance, bridging nearly 1,000 years with relatively little translation. That S, your solid linguistic fact, Icelandic has changed far less over time than most European languages. You imagine a teenager scrolling through social media and then, in the same afternoon, reading a passage from Anshel Saga with only mild confusion. Continuity feels almost tangible. Historians and linguists still argue how much of this stability results from geographic isolation versus deliberate preservation policy. Likely both committees actively create new Icelandic words for modern concepts rather than importing foreign terms wholesale. For example, the word for computer, talva, combines tala number and valva prophetess, a number prophetess. Even technology gets mythic flair. That S joke number 1. Leave it to Iceland to give your laptop a mystical job title. Cultural continuity extends beyond vocabulary. The sagas are not dusty relics. They are national touchstones. Quotes surface in speeches. Story structures influence modern literature. Even contemporary crime novels sometimes carry a faint echo of feud logic motives rooted in reputation and quiet grudges. Historians still argue whether modern Icelanders consciously model aspects of identity on saga ideals, or whether the influence operates more subconsciously. Either way, the literary past remains active. Thingvellir itself becomes a ritual space. National Day celebrations occur here. School groups visit, couples walk along the Rift Valley, pausing where tectonic plates part. The site's UNESCO designation reinforces its symbolic weight. You imagine the valley layered with invisible scenes. Wargeir under his cloak, chieftains arguing, independence declared in 1954, tourists adjusting camera angles. Nature remains an equal partner in identity. Earthquakes tremble occasionally beneath daily routines. Geothermal pools steam reliably in winter darkness. The northern lights ripple green across black skies. Scientists monitor seismic activity carefully. Iceland sits astride the mid-Atlantic ridge, one of the most geologically active zones on Earth. That's your firm geological fact. Iceland's position on diverging tectonic plates shapes both its landscape and its energy resources. Historians still argue how deeply this volatile environment influences national psychology. Does living with constant geological change cultivate resilience? Or is that a romantic projection? Perhaps both interpretations contain truth. Community, too, feels distinct in a small population. In Reykjavik, it's joked that everyone is only a few degrees of separation apart. Genealogy databases are famously thorough. Icelanders can trace family lines back centuries. Here, your quirky tidbit, there's even an app that helps Icelanders check whether they closely related before dating. It's less awkward than discovering shared great-great-grandparents at a family reunion. That Joke number 2. When your medieval ancestors were busy naming every cousin in the sagas, you inherit impressive record keeping. Political culture remains comparatively direct. Public trust in institutions, while tested during crises like 2008, tends to recover through visible accountability. Coalition governments require negotiation. Extreme polarization is less pronounced than in many larger democracies. Historians still debate whether small-scale inherently fosters civic trust or whether Iceland's particular historical pathflow-based governance from the Althing onward plays a more decisive role. Education and literacy rates are high. Book publishing per capita is famously robust, especially during the Christmas book flood when new titles flood the market before the holidays. Giving books as gifts remains a cherished tradition. You imagine a winter evening, snow outside, geothermal heat inside. Someone unwrapping a newly published novel. Continuity again. That's joke number 3. Softly shared. In Iceland, Santa might plausibly bring you both a thriller and a 13th century manuscript reprint. Environmental consciousness grows stronger in recent decades. Climate change threatens glaciers like Vatnajökull, Europe's largest ice cap. Renewable energy remains a point of pride, yet tourism and heavy industry pose balancing challenges. Historians and environmental scholars still argue how Iceland will navigate the tension between economic growth and ecological preservation. The island's beauty is both asset and responsibility. You sit quietly, aware that identity here is not static. It adapts Viking myth alongside digital innovation. Geothermal pipelines beneath modern apartments, NATO membership paired with no standing army. From Eric the Red branding Greenland with optimistic marketing to contemporary policymakers branding Iceland as a green energy leader, narrative matters. The fire at your feet dims further, embers glowing like the last lines of a well-loved manuscript. Above you, the Rift Valley stands silent, patient. You sense that Iceland's true continuity lies not in any single era, but in the rhythm of adaptation law over chaos, language over silence, community over fragmentation. The plates beneath you drift a few millimeters this year, almost nothing, almost imperceptible. And yet, over centuries, that drift shapes continents, just as stories, retold and rewritten, shape nations. The embers breathe softly now, a slow pulse of orange beneath ash, and the night air feels cooler against your skin. You remain at Thingvellir, but your gaze turns outward beyond the valley, beyond Reykjavik, to the vast Atlantic that has always both isolated and connected this island. Geography has never been neutral here. Iceland sits almost equidistant between North America and Europe, perched atop the mid-Atlantic ridge like a geological punctuation mark. For centuries, that meant remoteness. In the 20th and 21st centuries, it means strategic centrality. That S, your firm geopolitical fact, Iceland's location in the North Atlantic has made it strategically important for transatlantic shipping lanes, submarine monitoring, and aviation routes, especially during World War II and the Cold War. You imagine invisible lines stretching beneath the sea fiber optic cables carrying internet traffic, shipping routes hauling goods, patrol paths once traced by NATO aircraft. What was once a barrier of storms and uncertainty is now a corridor of data and diplomacy. Historians still argue whether Iceland's strategic relevance has diminished since the Cold War or simply evolved into new forms, particularly with renewed Arctic interest as sea ice retreats. Ah, yes, the Arctic. Climate change is reshaping northern geopolitics. As Arctic sea routes potentially open for longer periods each year, global powers pay closer attention to northern territories. Iceland, while not within the Arctic Circle entirely, participates actively in Arctic Council discussions. You picture diplomats in tailored suits discussing shipping lanes and environmental safeguards. While outside, wind still whips across lava fields with complete indifference. Here's your quirky tidbit. Despite its icy name, Iceland's capital Reykjavik is actually warmer in winter than many cities at similar latitudes, thanks to the Gulf Stream. So when someone imagines perpetual polar darkness and frozen misery, you can gently correct them. That S, joke number 1, Greenland may be icy, and Iceland comparatively green-neric, the red. S, branding still causing mild confusion a millennium later. Economically, fishing remains vital, though no longer singular. Carefully managed quotas aim to prevent overfishing, a lesson reinforced by the cod wars and global examples of stock collapse. Historians and environmental economists still argue whether Iceland's quota system represents a model of sustainable fisheries management or a consolidation of wealth among quota holders. Sustainability and equity don't always align neatly. Meanwhile, tourism so explosive in the 2010s faces a sudden shock in 2020 with the global COVID-19 pandemic. Borders tighten, flights diminish, hotels empty. That's your mainstream recent historical fact. The pandemic significantly disrupts Iceland's tourism-dependent economy, as it did worldwide. You imagine Keflavik Airport, unusually quiet, wind moving across empty runways. A strange stillness returns, reminiscent perhaps of earlier centuries when travel was rare and seasonal. Historians still debate how profoundly the pandemic will reshape global mobility long-term. For Iceland, it underscores once again the risks of concentrated economic reliance. Yet adaptation follows. Domestic tourism rises, remote work becomes more feasible. Digital infrastructure, already strong, supports continuity. That's joke number 2, gently offered. When your ancestors survived volcanic famine, a Zoom meeting feels comparatively manageable. Culturally, Iceland continues exporting influence disproportionate to its size. Musicians, writers, filmmakers gain international acclaim. The stark landscapes become cinematic backdrops for global productions. You imagine a film crew setting up cameras against a glacier, while locals casually walk dogs nearby. Epic fantasy aesthetics meet everyday errands. Historians of culture still argue how global attention reshapes local identity. Does repeated portrayal as otherworldly freeze Iceland in a mythic frame? Or does it simply add another chapter to an already layered narrative? Back at Thingvellir, the Rift Valley remains unbothered by cinematic ambitions. Moss grows quietly on lava rock. Water slips through fissures. You think about sovereignty in this interconnected era. Iceland is independent, yes, but bound into trade agreements, climate accords, NATO structures, Arctic councils. Modern independence is networked, not solitary. Historians still debate whether small states enjoy greater agility in global diplomacy or greater vulnerability. Iceland's record suggests both possibilities coexist. Energy policy continues to evolve. Hydropower and geothermal plants supply electricity not only for households, but for energy-intensive industries like aluminum smelting. Critics question environmental impact. Supporters emphasize economic necessity and renewable credentials. That's joke number 3. In Iceland, even industrial debates come with dramatic mountain backdrops. You sit quietly and notice how the narrative keeps circling back to balance between isolation and integration. Nature and industry, preservation and adaptation. The same Atlantic that once carried Eric the Red westward now carries container ships and data cables. The same valley that hosted pagan chieftains now welcomes diplomats and hikers. Continuity does not mean stagnation. It means carrying forward a core while negotiating change. The embers flicker lower, but they do not extinguish. Above you, stars scatter across the dark sky, reflected faintly in still water pooled between tectonic plates. Iceland remains perched between worlds old and new, Europe and America, lava and ice. And you remain here, listening to the quiet hum of a nation that has learned to turn geography from obstacle into opportunity. The Atlantic wind brushes your cheek, steady and patient. History, like the tide, keeps moving. The wind shifts, just slightly, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and distant water. The fire is mostly embers now, but it still offers enough warmth to keep your hands comfortable as you sit here at Thingvellir, watching the dark valley breathe. But to something else, belief, imagination, and the strange way ancient myths and modern science coexist in this place. Iceland is often described as a secular country, and if you look at the stats, that's largely true. Church attendance isn't what it used to be, but religion and folklore still linger in these quiet, curious ways that you can't just ignore. The big historical moment here was when Christianity was officially adopted, right here at the Althing. It was a compromise, a decision made to prevent a civil war between pagan and Christian groups. That peaceful transition is still one of the most remarkable events in all of medieval European history. Historians still debate whether it was a purely political move for survival or a genuine spiritual shift. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, belief and survival twisted together like braids. But even with the official faith, the older threads never completely disappeared. You've probably heard the stories about Icelanders and elves, or, more accurately, the hidden people, the huldufólk. Over the years, surveys have shown that a surprising number of Icelanders either believe they exist or, at the very least, they're not willing to say they don't. Now, before you start picturing tiny winged fairies, understand that the huldufólk are described as human-like beings living in a world parallel to ours, just out of sight. They're said to live in rocks, hills, and these quiet, empty landscapes. And here, as a quirky little fact for you, there have been actual cases where road construction projects were rerouted to avoid disturbing certain rocks, believed to be homes for the huldufólk, whether it was done out of genuine cultural respect, community pressure, or just as a great PR stunt. The detours happened. That's your first Icelandic joke. Even the infrastructure sometimes has to negotiate with folklore. Now, academics love to argue about this. Do modern Icelanders who talk about elves literally believe in them? Is it more of a symbol of their cultural identity? Or is it just a playful national quirk, great for tourism and telling stories? The answer really depends on who you ask, and maybe on how dark the winter night is when you ask them. You can just picture it. A construction crew pausing their heavy machinery, looking at a peculiar boulder, and deciding it's probably not worth messing with their unseen neighbors. Is that rational? Superstitious? Or maybe it's just being politely cautious. At the very same time, Iceland is a world leader in science and education. Geologists are here tracking every tiny seismic tremor. Meteorologists use satellites to monitor volcanic plumes with incredible precision. Medical research is constantly advancing. Belief and scientific fact just seem to coexist here without crashing into each other. A person can check the latest scientific forecast for a volcano and, in the next breath, tell a story about hidden beings. It seems that having strong Wi-Fi doesn't automatically cancel out your imagination. And let's be honest, here's joke number 2. If you lived in a landscape where steam literally rises from the ground and the earth occasionally cracks open, you might leave a little room for magic, too. It just makes sense. This blend of reality and myth goes way back. The ancient sagas are full of it. You have ghosts walking around in Greta's saga, prophecies and hauntings in Eyrbyggja saga, dreams that carry deadly warnings. The line between what's natural and what's supernatural feels incredibly thin. Again, historians argue about what this meant to the original audience. Were they supposed to believe these hauntings were real events, or just literary flair to make the story more exciting? That debate is probably still happening right now in some university office over some very strong coffee. Back here at Thingvellir, belief used to have legal power. Oaths sworn on sacred objects were a huge deal. Your reputation had spiritual consequences, not just social ones. Today, the legal system is modern and bureaucratic, but the idea that words matter is still deeply embedded in the culture. Promises carry weight. Language is treated with dignity. You can't help but think about those long winter nights centuries ago. No electricity, just the flickering light from a fire or an oil lamp. The darkness was filled with stories of elves, trolls, ghosts, and heroes. The vast shadowed landscape outside just begged for imagination to fill it. Modern Reykjavik glows with streetlights and neon, but the winter darkness is still just as long. And maybe that's why storytelling never really loses its purpose here. And that brings us to joke number 3. Soft as falling ash. When you only get 4 hours of daylight, even a rock can start to look like a good conversationalist. Meanwhile, spirituality is taking new forms. Some Icelanders today practice azatro, which is a modern revival of the old pre-Christian Norse religion. It was officially recognized by the government back in 1973. While it's still a minority faith, its existence shows that people are still fascinated by their ancestral beliefs. Scholars argue whether this revival is an authentic continuation of old traditions or a modern reinterpretation. After all, most of what we know about the Old Norse religion was written down by Christians centuries later. So a lot of it has to be reconstructed with imagination. But maybe imagination isn't a weakness. Maybe it's the whole point. You look up at the night sky. The stars are so sharp in the cold, clear air. Somewhere deep beneath your feet, geothermal heat is pulsing through the earth, and the tectonic plates are continuing their slow, silent drift. In a place where the earth itself feels so alive, it seems perfectly natural to imagine you have some hidden neighbors. Yet this is the same society that builds advanced data centers, pioneers renewable energy, and is a full participant in the global scientific community. This duality doesn't feel like a contradiction. It feels more like harmony. Belief, like lava, eventually cools and hardens into solid rock, but it always retains the memory of its heat. Whether the elves live in the rocks or just in the stories themselves are what shape this country's identity. And right here, in this ancient valley, myth and modernity sit comfortably together, just like you and the quiet night. Thank you for watching. The night settles deeper, the stars sharpening as the last flame finally gives up and becomes a faint ribbon of smoke. You don't relight the fire, you let the darkness thicken, because now your attention turns to something quieter than myth and subtler than politics' daily life. Not kings or eruptions or parliaments, but mornings, meals, ordinary Tuesdays in a land built on lava. You picture Reykjavik at 7:30 a.m. A pale blue light edges over the horizon in winter, if it rises at all. People step out of compact houses, warmed by geothermal heat. That's your mainstream fact. Roughly 90% of Icelandic homes are heated using geothermal energy, piped directly from the earth. The planet itself keeps the radiators warm. You imagine turning on a faucet and smelling the faint sulfur scent in the hot water. It's harmless, just dissolved minerals from deep underground, but it does mean your shower occasionally smells like a very polite volcano. That's joke number 1. In Iceland, even your shampoo routine comes with geothermal authenticity. School children bundle into coats, reflective strips glinting in low light. Education is free and widely accessible, with strong literacy rates that trace their lineage all the way back to saga copying farmers. Reading has never been optional here. It's practically atmospheric. Historians still argue whether Iceland's early emphasis on literacy was primarily religious so people could read scripture, or cultural, driven by a broader appetite for storytelling and law. Either way, the result is enduring. You imagine a classroom where a teacher explains medieval blood feuds in the morning and algebra in the afternoon. The sagas are not remote artifacts. They're part of curriculum. Workdays begin. Fishing vessels head out from harbor towns like Akureyri and Isafjörður. Office workers open laptops in glass-fronted buildings. Artists sketch in cafes. Nurses rotate through hospital shifts. Despite its small population, just under 400,000, Iceland maintains complex modern infrastructure. Healthcare, universities, transport networks. Scale is modest. Systems are not. Here's your quirky tidbit. Because of the small population, Iceland sometimes struggles with very specific professional shortages. There have been periods where the country had only a handful of neurosurgeons, meaning you really hope your brain behaves itself. That's joke number 2. In a small nation, even your medical specialist might be someone's cousin. Food reflects both history and adaptation. Traditional dishes include lamb, skyr, a thick dairy product dating back to the settlement era, and fish in nearly infinite variations. Skyr, technically closer to cheese than yogurt, has become an international export in recent years. The mainstream culinary fact: skyr has been a staple of Icelandic diets since the Viking Age, sustained through centuries of farming and trade. You picture a breakfast bowl skyr, topped with berries, perhaps imported, perhaps greenhouse-grown using geothermal heat. Tomatoes flourish year-round in warm glass houses despite snow outside. Historians and agricultural scholars still debate how food security will evolve in a warming climate. Will Iceland become more agriculturally independent, or will global trade remain essential? The conversation continues quietly in policy meetings and farm kitchens alike. You imagine lunchtime conversations topics ranging from weather, forecasts, to political developments to someone's upcoming hiking trip. Outdoor recreation remains deeply woven into daily life. Weekends often mean driving out to waterfalls, glaciers, or coastal cliffs. Even urban dwellers are rarely far from raw landscape. That's joke number 3. Your quick nature break might involve standing beside a waterfall that looks suspiciously like a fantasy film set. Public pools serve as social hubs. Heated by geothermal energy, they stay open year-round. People soak in hot tubs while discussing everything from local gossip to international affairs. Steam rises, snow falls, conversations drift. Historians still argue whether these communal bathing spaces function as modern equivalents to medieval gathering sites, a softer echo of the Althing assembly fields. In the darker months, seasonal rhythms matter. Winter brings long nights, but also cozy interiors, candles in windows, concerts, and book releases. Summer reverses everything. The midnight sun lingers, sleep schedules wobble, curtains become essential. You imagine lying in bed at midnight in June, sunlight snaking around the edges of blackout shades, birds still chirping enthusiastically. Time itself feels slightly confused. Daily life also includes the quiet awareness of nature's volatility. Earthquakes sometimes rattle shelves. Volcano alerts occasionally appear in news updates. People check seismic apps the way others check traffic reports. Yet panic is rare. Preparedness is routine. Historians still debate whether repeated exposure to natural disruption fosters calm, resilience, or simply normalized vigilance. When you grow up with tectonic plates underfoot, flexibility becomes second nature. As you sit in the dark at Thingvellir, you sense how all these ordinary moments accumulate into something powerful. Nations are not only shaped by dramatic turning points, but by breakfasts, homework, fishing quotas, and hot tubs. The sagas chronicled feuds and heroes, but behind every feud were people milking sheep and mending nets. Behind every hero, someone cooked dinner. Modern Iceland continues in that rhythm. Work, rest, story, adapt. The valley around you remains still. Somewhere far away, a city bus hums. A greenhouse light glows, a fishing trawler shifts course. Life, steady and unglamorous, persists. And in that persistence, you find the true heartbeat of a place that has learned over centuries how to live with fire under its feet and stories in its bones. The darkness feels complete now, not heavy, just full like a thick wool blanket laid gently across the valley. I'm sitting here at Thingvellir, and my thoughts drift toward something that quietly holds everything together: memory. Not just memory written in sagas, not just monuments or museums, but the way a society chooses what to remember and what to gently let fade. Iceland's historical consciousness is unusually vivid. A huge part of that comes from the written record: the Icelandingabók, the Book of Icelanders, and the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, meticulously trace genealogies from the very beginning. They name who arrived, where they settled, and who married whom. This is a mainstream historical fact. Few medieval societies preserved such detailed accounts of their early settlement as Iceland did in these foundational texts. I can just imagine scribes copying down names by flickering lamplight, preserving family lines as if they were the most delicate heirlooms. In a small, interconnected population like Iceland's, genealogy isn't some abstract concept, it's deeply personal. It's the map of who you are and where you come from. Of course, historians still argue about how strictly factual these early accounts really are. Were they precise records? Were they political tools used to legitimize land claims and social status? Or were they carefully curated narratives? The most likely answer is that they served all three purposes at once. After all, memory is rarely neutral. Think about the national museums you find in Reykjavik. You see carefully preserved fragments of turf houses, Viking-age tools that have been pulled from the earth, and weathered artifacts from old churches. These objects once served practical, everyday roles, and now they rest under soft lighting, perfectly labeled and contextualized for us to understand. And this brings me to a quirky tidbit about Iceland. For a while, the country was home to the Icelandic Phallological Museum, a place dedicated to preserving and displaying animal phallic specimens. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. It was presented in a scholarly, anatomical way, and it was surprisingly popular with tourists. I guess that my first joke for you. When your national sagas are already filled with intense drama and violence, your museums apparently decide to keep things thorough. But beyond the unusual exhibits, there's something deeper going on. Preservation matters intensely here. Old turf houses are carefully reconstructed. Medieval manuscripts are digitized for future generations. Oral traditions and folktales are recorded before they can fade away. There's a powerful drive to hold on to the past. A great example of this happened in the 20th century. Many of the medieval manuscripts, the sagas themselves, had been kept in Denmark for centuries. Over several decades, a process began to return them to Iceland. That repatriation became a major cultural milestone, a moment of immense national pride. Historians still debate the true meaning of this event. Was their return primarily a cultural restoration, a post-colonial correction of a historical wrong, or a gesture of diplomatic goodwill? However you frame it, The arrival of those manuscripts back on Icelandic soil resonated profoundly with the people. I can almost picture the scene, crates being carefully opened, the ancient parchment pages being examined with reverence. The ink might be faded, but the stories were legible. The stories were finally traveling home. Thingvellir itself, where I'm sitting, serves as a living memory site. It's not just a scenic national park, it's layered with history. This was the site of the ancient pagan assembly, the Althing. This is where Icelanders made the monumental decision to convert to Christianity. This is where they acknowledged royal authority from Norway and Denmark. And this is where, in 1944, they declared their full independence. Each generation that comes here reinterprets this valley just a little bit differently. Which leads me to my second joke. This Rift Valley has hosted more plot twists than most television series. Of course, collective memory also includes the harder chapters. The Laki eruption in 1783 brought a devastating famine and death that wiped out a huge portion of the population. The 1918 Katla eruption spread ash across farmland, ruining crops. And the 2008 financial collapse shook trust and livelihoods to their core. But these events aren't erased from the national story. They're studied, they're discussed, and they're woven into the public narrative. Resilience becomes a core part of the Icelandic identity, not in a boastful way, but in a steady acknowledgement that survival has always required adaptation. Historians do point out that national narratives can sometimes smooth over internal conflicts or inequalities in favor of presenting a unified front. Memory can comfort, but it can also simplify a more complicated truth. Yet, what's fascinating about the Icelandic sagas is that they often preserve multiple perspectives within a single story. Heroes and anti-heroes share the same space. Moral clarity is rare. And perhaps that complexity, that comfort with ambiguity, has shaped how Iceland approaches its own past. You can see this reflected in modern memorials. Instead of grand triumphalist statues, you often find a sense of restraints, simple stone markers, quiet inscriptions, or just landscapes that are allowed to speak for themselves. Even the cemeteries in Reykjavik feel understated. You see names carved into stone without excessive flourish, as the wind brushes through the grass. Here, as my third and final gentle joke, in a country where the earth itself regularly explodes, putting up a subtle headstone feels like a design choice rooted in deep humility. Education plays a key role in sustaining this memory. Students in Iceland learn not only global history, but a detailed national chronology. They learn about the Althing's medieval origins, the Reformation, the period under Danish rule, and the fight for independence. Again, historians debate how small nations should balance national pride with critical reflection. Too much nostalgia risks creating myths that aren't true, but too much critique risks a sense of detachment from your own heritage. Iceland seems to navigate a path somewhere in between. I can just imagine a family gathered at dinner. Someone might reference an ancestor who farmed in the Westfords hundreds of years ago. Another might mention a saga character who is tied loosely, perhaps, even fancifully, to their family lineage. Here, the boundary between legend and lineage feels incredibly thin. Memory isn't a static thing stored in a book. It's active, it's conversational, it's part of daily life. Even the landscape itself remembers. The vast lava fields record ancient eruptions. The glacial valleys mark the paths of ancient ice flows. The fault lines reveal the constant tectonic shifts happening right beneath your feet. The earth itself carries an archive written in stone. I'm glancing at the darkened fire pit beside me. It's just ash now, but a little while ago, it was flame. Memory works the same way the heat of an event cools over time into a story. The manuscripts, the museums, the genealogies, the repatriated pages, and the quiet memorials, they all form a mosaic of this nation's past. Historians will always argue about the emphasis, the interpretation, and the framing of the narrative. But beneath all that debate lies a shared, unspoken commitment. Do not forget. I breathe in the cold, clean air, and feel the weight of centuries. But it doesn't feel like a burden. It feels grounding. This valley has witnessed argument, compromise, loss, declaration, and celebration. And me, sitting here now, I become a small part of its ongoing memory, other quiet observer in a long line of listeners who have come to this very spot. The night remains still. History doesn't shout, it hums. Thanks for joining me on this reflection. If you enjoyed this journey into Iceland's memory, Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from around the world. See you next time. The valley feels almost weightless now, as if the dark itself has thinned into something transparent. You sit wrapped in quiet, and your thoughts drift toward Iceland's relationship with the wider world, not through politics this time, but through migration. Who comes, who leaves, who returns. For centuries, emigration was a necessity. In the late 19th century, harsh weather, volcanic activity, and limited farmland pushed many Icelanders to seek opportunity elsewhere. That's your mainstream historical fact. Between the 1870s and early 20th century, roughly 20% of Iceland's population emigrated, many to North America, especially Canada and the United States. You imagine families boarding ships, carrying little more than tools, Bibles, and perhaps a carefully wrapped manuscript copy. Manitoba became a notable destination. A community known as New Iceland was established along Lake Winnipeg. Historians still argue how deeply this migration altered Icelandic society at home. Did it relieve demographic pressure, or did it drain valuable labor and cultural continuity? Both consequences likely unfolded simultaneously. Back at Thingvellir, the idea of departure feels poignant. This valley once held an entire nation's assembly. Now you picture it watching people leave its shores. But migration is not a one-way story. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Iceland gradually became a destination rather than merely a point of departure. Economic growth, especially during the early 2000s, boom drew workers from Eastern Europe and beyond. That's your contemporary demographic fact. Today, immigrants make up a growing percentage of Iceland's population, with Polish communities representing one of the largest foreign-born groups. You imagine Reykjavik streets where Icelandic, Polish, English, and other languages intermingle. Small grocery stores stock imported goods. Children switch between languages on playgrounds. Here's your quirky tidbit. Because Icelandic naming conventions traditionally use patronymics, like Johnson or Johnstatier, newcomers sometimes find the system both charming and mildly confusing. There are no family surnames in the conventional sense, just son of or daughter of, that's joke number one, in Iceland. Your last name updates like a software patch every generation. Historians and sociologists still argue how immigration will reshape Icelandic identity over time. Can a language so carefully preserved remain robust amid globalization? Will new cultural influences blend seamlessly or challenge long-held norms? The debate is ongoing, but daily life continues without dramatic rupture. You imagine a classroom where a child whose grandparents arrived from Poland recites lines from Unjealous Saga alongside classmates whose families trace back to settlementira farmers. Continuity meets change in subtle ways. Meanwhile, Icelanders abroad maintain connections. Descendants of 19th century immigrants in Canada still celebrate Icelandic heritage festivals. Flags wave. Traditional foods are prepared. Sagas are read aloud. Historians still debate how diaspora communities preserve frozen versions of culture that evolve differently from the homeland. Sometimes traditions abroad remain older in style than those at home, creating a curious time lag effect. You think about identity as something portable. Settlers once carried it across the Atlantic in longships. Later, emigrants carried it in steamships. Today, it travels through video calls and social media. That S joke too. It's much easier to maintain cultural ties when your longship has Wi-Fi. Iceland's small population means integration often occurs at close quarters. In a city the size of Reykjavik, communities overlap quickly. There is less anonymity, more visibility. Historians still argue whether this scale fosters inclusion through familiarity or increases pressure to conform. The answer likely varies by individual experience. Back in the 9th century, settlers themselves were migrants Norwegians, Celts, enslaved peoples from the British Isles. Iceland began as a multicultural experiment, even if medieval terminology would not have described it that way. Genetic studies reveal that while many male settlers traced origins to Scandinavia, a significant proportion of female ancestry links to the British Isles. That S, your grounded scientific fact. Iceland's genetic makeup reflects both Norse and Celtic contributions. You imagine early settlement camps blending languages and customs under open skies. Diversity is not new, here it is foundational. Historians still debate how these early cultural interactions shaped saga traditions and social norms. Did Celtic storytelling influences shape narrative style? The possibility lingers. As you sit quietly, you realize migration is simply another version of drift-like. Tectonic plates shifting like lava, flowing and cooling. People move, culture adjusts. Iceland today exports music, literature, design. It imports labor, ideas, cuisine. The Atlantic remains a bridge. That's joke number 3, soft and warm. After centuries of braving stormy seas, the island now imports avocados with impressive efficiency. The valley around you remains still, indifferent to passports and policies. It has watched arrivals and departures for over 1,000 years. Some leave and never return. Some leave and come back. Some arrive and decide to stay. Identity stretches, accommodates, redefines itself without entirely unraveling. You breathe in the cold air and sense that belonging here has always required adaptation. The first settlers adapted to volcanic soil and harsh winters. Later generations adapted to foreign rule. Modern Iceland adapts to globalization. Migration is not an interruption of history. It is one of its oldest patterns. And beneath the quiet stars, you feel the steady truth that movement across oceans, across centuries is simply another way stories travel. The night has reached that delicate hour when everything feels suspended. No longer evening, not yet morning. You sit in the deep hush of Thingvellir and let your thoughts drift toward power. Not the loud kind of power, with crowns and banwich, but the quieter current's leadership, equality, and how a small island keeps redefining who gets a voice. Iceland's political system today is a parliamentary republic. The president serves largely as a ceremonial head of state. While executive power rests with the prime minister and cabinet, that's your straightforward modern fact. Iceland's government is structured as a representative democracy with proportional parliamentary elections. But the detail that often captures global attention is this. In 1980, Iceland elected Vigdis Finnbogadóttir as president, making her the first woman in the world to be democratically elected as a head of state. You imagine that moment, ballots counted, history quietly tilting. No dramatic revolution, just voters deciding calmly and collectively that leadership did not require a Y chromosome. Historians still argue whether Iceland's relatively small population made such a milestone easier to achieve, or whether deeper cultural factors, strong literacy, civic participation, and earlier movements for women's rights laid essential groundwork. And there was groundwork. In 1975, 90% of Icelandic women went on strike for a day to demonstrate their importance in both paid and unpaid labor. The country effectively paused. Schools closed. Businesses stalled. Fathers scrambled to bring children to work. That's joke number 1. An entire nation discovering, in real time, that sandwiches do not make themselves. The strike proved transformative. It reshaped public conversation about gender equality and paved the way for future reforms. Today, Iceland frequently ranks near the top of global gender equality indexes. Parental leave policies encourage shared caregiving. Women occupy prominent roles in politics, business, academia. Historians and sociologists still debate how much of this progress stems from cultural homogeneity versus deliberate policy design. Equality is never automatic, it's negotiated. You glance at the dark valley and imagine medieval assemblies dominated by chieftains, almost exclusively male. Yet even within the sagas, women exert influence negotiating marriages, urging vengeance, shaping outcomes through counsel and strategy. Figures like Halgaror in Angela's saga or Gurun in Laxdæla saga are complex, powerful, and far from silent. Their agency may not have equaled modern standards, but it was not invisible. Historians still argue how accurately these saga portrayals reflect medieval reality. Were they literary exaggerations? Or did women wield more social influence than legal codes suggest? The debate hums quietly, like wind through grass. Beyond gender, modern Iceland also grapples with broader questions of representation and inclusion. LGBTQ+ rights have advanced significantly. In Ardingling, Johanna Sigur Ardóttir became one of the world's first openly gay heads of government. You imagine the quiet normalcy of that factless spectacle than in many countries. More continuation of a broader equality trend. That's joke number 2. In Iceland, groundbreaking political milestones sometimes arrive with the understated vibe of someone calmly refilling their coffee. Historians still debate whether Iceland's scale makes political shifts feel less polarizing. In a smaller society, ideological divides exist, but social proximity can temper extremes. It's harder to demonize someone when you might see them at the swimming pool tomorrow. Civic engagement remains relatively high. Voter turnout in national elections consistently exceeds many larger democracies. Public debates can be vigorous, but often remain grounded in consensus-building traditions that echo the Althingist origins. And here you are sitting at the very site where early chieftains once debated law and compromise under open skies. Power here began not in palaces, but in fields. That most joke number 3, the original parliamentary chamber came with excellent ventilation and 0 air conditioning bills. Historians still argue whether the Althing's medieval structure can truly be called democratic by modern standards. It represented free landowning men, not the entire population. Yet its procedural emphasis on law and negotiation created a durable institutional memory. Modern Iceland inherits that legacy not perfectly, not without flaws, but visibly. You sense how the arc bends across centuries, from chieftains asserting influence through kinship networks to citizens casting ballots in proportional elections, from pagan compromise to secular pluralism. From exclusion toward expanding inclusion, power shifts, but process endures. The valley remains patient. It has witnessed assemblies where law was spoken aloud, where conversion was negotiated, where independence was declared, where presidents addressed crowds. You sit quietly in the dark and feel the soft continuity between then and now. Leadership here has changed faces, voices, genders, orientations. Yet the deeper rhythm the gathering, the debating, the collective decision, persists above you. Stars glimmer cold and distant. Below you, tectonic plates continue their slow divergence. And somewhere between earth and sky, a small nation keeps redefining who stands at the center of the circle. The air feels colder now, the kind of cold that doesn't bite, but settles softly into your sleeves and collar. You remain at Thingvellir, long past the hour when most visitors have gone home. And your thoughts drift toward art because, if a nation sits between fire and ice, it eventually learns to sing about it. Iceland's artistic output often feels larger than its population would suggest. Literature, of course, stands at the center. The medieval sagas laid a foundation of narrative realism, psychological nuance, and dry understatement that still echoes today. The mainstream cultural fact is this: Reykjavik was designated a UNESCO City of Literature in 2011. Recognizing its deep literary heritage and vibrant contemporary writing scene, you imagine bookstores glowing warmly on Logavor Street, shelves stacked high in December during the Christmas book flood, families exchanging novels like sacred gifts, writers debating metaphors over coffee. Historians and literary scholars still argue whether the sagas directly shape modern Icelandic prose style, or whether that influence is sometimes overstated in national self-understanding. It's difficult to measure stylistic inheritance across centuries, but the tonal similarity measured, sparse, observant feels real. And then there's music. Iceland's music scene carries an almost mythic global presence. Artists experiment freely folk, blended with electronic choral harmonies layered over minimalist beats. One of the most internationally recognized figures is Björk, whose career spans decades of boundary-pushing sound and visual art. You imagine her voice rising like geothermal steam, unpredictable, elemental, entirely distinct. That's joke number 1. In Iceland, even your pop stars sound like they might summon a glacier. Historians of culture still debate whether the island's dramatic landscape directly shapes its artistic sensibilities, or whether that connection is a romantic narrative embraced for export. Does volcanic terrain produce experimental music? Or do humans simply like linking art to scenery? Probably both. Humans love a good metaphor. Film has also found fertile ground here. Stark coastlines and lava fields serve as backdrops for international productions. But domestic cinema thrives as well, often blending dark humor with understated realism echoing saga restraint in modern form. You picture a small film crew braving coastal winds to capture a single perfect shot of waves crashing against basalt cliffs. That's joke number 2 in Icelandic filmmaking. Weather is not a production, obstacle it's a co-star with strong opinions. Visual art reflects similar themes. Painters capture light that shifts dramatically with season. Sculptors work with volcanic stone and steel, playing with contrast between fragility and permanence. Historians still argue whether the nation's late urbanization, Reykjavik, only truly expanding in the 20th century, out artistic communities to remain more tightly interconnected than in larger capitals. In a city of modest scale, collaboration becomes almost inevitable, and then there is language itself, as art. Contemporary poets continue to experiment within Icelandic's ancient grammatical structures. The language's continuity provides both constraint and creative opportunity. You imagine a poet standing near this very rift valley, reciting lines shaped by words that might have been recognizable to a 13th century scribe. That continuity feels almost magical, not in a Huldafock sense this time, but in a linguistic one. Speaking of magic, folklore remains embedded in artistic expression. Elves, trolls, and hidden people surface in children's books and stage productions, not always as literal belief, but as cultural texture. That's joke number 3. If your national mythology includes rock-dwelling neighbors, your bedtime stories write themselves. Historians and folklorists still debate how much contemporary references to hidden beings represent living tradition versus nostalgic revival. Either way, the imagery persists. Public art also interacts with landscape in deliberate ways. Sculptures face the sea. Installations respond to geothermal steam. Architecture blends modern minimalism with practical insulation against wind and snow. You sense how art here rarely tries to overpower nature. Instead, it converses with it. Even something as practical as sweater design, those iconic Lopapesa patterns, reflects visual storytelling. Geometric motifs circle the shoulders like protective symbols. Wool, from Icelandic sheep, adapted over centuries to harsh climate, becomes wearable history. You imagine pulling such a sweater tighter against the cold, wrapped in both warmth and lineage. Historians still argue whether national artistic identity is something organic or something curated for international recognition. Iceland certainly markets its creativity, but the roots feel authentic, deep, stubborn, like moss-gripping lava rock. The valley around you remains silent, but in your mind, it hums with music, recitations, film reels, brushstrokes. Art, like tectonic drift, moves slowly and steadily. It reshapes perception over time. From saga manuscripts copied in turf houses to digital compositions streamed worldwide, the creative impulse never left this island. It evolved. You sit in the cold dark and sense how storytelling, whether sung, written, painted, or filmed, has always been Iceland's way of translating landscape into meaning. The wind brushes your cheek again, softer now, and somewhere far beyond sight, in a lit studio or quiet writing room, someone shapes a new line of poetry that carries echoes of everything you've been tracing tonight. The horizon begins to pale this barely. Not sunrise yet, but a loosening of darkness, a thinning at the edges. You remain seated in the quiet of Thingvellir, and your thoughts drift toward time itself, not history as events, but history as scale. Deep time, geological time, the kind that makes even Viking sagas feel like yesterday's notes. Because beneath everything you've considered tonight, migration, art, belief there is bedrock. Literally, Iceland is one of the youngest landmasses on Earth in geological terms. The island began forming around 16 to 18 million years ago as volcanic activity built layer upon layer of basalt above the mid-Atlantic ridge. That's your grounded scientific fact. Iceland's existence is the result of persistent volcanic eruptions combined with tectonic plate divergence. You imagine molten rock rising through fissures, cooling, cracking, rising again. Creation not as a single event, but as repetition. Historians don't debate geology in quite the same way, but geologists still argue about the precise interaction between the mid-Atlantic ridge and a deep mantle plume often called the Iceland hotspot. Is the plume the primary driver? Or is ridge spreading sufficient explanation? The debate hums in academic journals, like distant seismic tremors. Here at Thingvellir, you are sitting directly between the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates. They drift apart roughly 2 centimeters per year. That's about the rate your fingernails grow. That's joke number 1. Continental drift, nature's slowest and most patient renovation project. You run your hand over the ground beside you and imagine that subtle motion, millimeter by millimeter, year by year. Rift widening, almost imperceptibly, yet undeniably, the sagas speak of feuds lasting generations, but the earth beneath those feuds has been reshaping itself for millions of years. You think about glaciers next. During the last ice age, Massive ice sheets carved valleys and fjords, shaping much of Iceland's present landscape. As the climate warmed, glaciers retreated, leaving behind moraines and polished rock. Today, glaciers still cover about 10% of the country's surface area, though they are shrinking. Vatnajökull, Europe's largest ice cap by volume, rests over active volcanoes appearing that feels almost theatrical. That's joke number 2. In Iceland, even your ice caps multitask with lava underneath. Historians and climate scientists still debate how rapidly glacial retreat will alter not only ecosystems, but national identity. When a glacier vanishes, does something cultural vanish with it? Or does identity adapt, as it always has? You imagine future generations reading about glaciers the way you read about medieval turf houses present in memory. Absent in daily experience, deep time also reframes human history. The first settlers arrived just over 1,100 years ago. That's less than a blink compared to the island's geological lifespan, and yet, in that brief blink, humans established law, literature, trade networks, religious transformation, foreign rule, independence, and digital infrastructure. You feel both small and impressed. The Earth builds slowly. Humans build quickly. That's joke number 3. Tectonic plates take millions of years to drift apart, but give humans Wi-Fi and we'll argue about it instantly. Historians still argue about how environmental constraints shaped Icelandic society. Did scarce, arable land foster cooperation? Did volcanic disruptions reinforce communal resilience? Environmental determinism is tempting, but never complete. Still, you cannot ignore the intimacy between land and life here. The Alþingi gathered at a tectonic rift. Conversion was declared in a landscape split between continents. Independence was proclaimed where plates quietly part. Geology becomes metaphor without even trying. You look up, the sky lightens further, stars fading one by one. Morning approaches, subtle and unhurried. Time layers itself, molten basalt, millions of years old. Glacial valleys carved tens of thousands of years ago. Sagas written 8 centuries ago. Independence declared less than a century ago. Tourists walking here yesterday, all of it resting on shifting stone. Historians still debate the long arc of Iceland's future. Will climate change redraw coastlines? Will renewable energy position the island as a model nation? Will population growth alter its character? No one can say with certainty, but tectonic plates will continue their steady separation. Lava will occasionally surface. Wind will sculpt moss and rock. You feel the quiet hum of processes too vast to hurry. And suddenly, the idea of boring history feels gently ironic. There is nothing dull about an island rising from fire, splitting continents, preserving medieval manuscripts, electing groundbreaking leaders, and negotiating with invisible Elfzal within a geological heartbeat. The light strengthens now, revealing the contours of the valley. You can see the fissures more clearly. The water pooled between rocks glimmers faintly. Night recedes. History remains, and you sit, very small and very present, at the seam of 2 continents, watching time unfold in both directions at once. The first true line of dawn slips across the valley, soft and silver, touching the edges of rock and moss, as if the earth itself is waking slowly. You remain seated at Thingvellir, wrapped in the afterglow of everything you've traced tonight's settlers and sagas. Eruptions and elections, driftwood churches, and digital cables humming beneath the Atlantic. Now the story narrows, not to a single event, but to you still here, breathing in the cool Icelandic morning. For over 1,000 years, people have gathered in this valley to listen, to law, to compromise, to poetry, to change. The medieval Alþingi met here, beginning in 1930, making it one of the world's oldest continuous parliamentary institutions. That's your final steady historical fact, resting like a cornerstone beneath everything else. Historians still argue whether continuous is technically precise, given suspensions and relocations over the centuries. But the symbolic thread is undeniable. The idea of assembly endured. You look around and imagine the layers again. Pagan chieftains shifting on cloaks. Wargeir lying beneath fur, deciding the spiritual future of a nation. Farmers debating grazing rights, Danish officials imposing authority. Citizens proclaiming independence in 1944. School children on field trips, tourists adjusting camera straps. You quietly present before sunrise. The rift between continents widens by those patient 2 centimeters each year. You cannot see it happen. you can only trust the measurement. That's joke number 1. Barely louder than a whisper. If only personal growth came with such reliable annual increments. The air smells faintly of damp stone. Birds begin tentative calls. Light gathers in the fissures, illuminating the path where tectonic plates part. Iceland's history has never been loud in the way empires are loud. No sprawling conquests, no vast colonial networks launched from these shores. Instead, it has been a history of adaptation, of surviving volcanic ash and economic collapse, of preserving language while absorbing change, of holding law in open fields rather than marble halls. Historians still argue about the balance between myth and reality in the sagas, about the precise motives of settlers, about the long-term effects of Danish rule, about the economic lessons of 2008. Debate persists, steady as wind. But debate itself is part of the inheritance. You stretch your legs slightly, feeling the stiffness of ours spent still. The ground beneath you, fractured and ancient, supports your weight without complaint. That's joke number 2. After millions of years of lava flows, your midnight sitting session barely registers as an inconvenience. The sun edges higher. Colors emerge: muted greens of moss, charcoal gray of basalt, the faint shimmer of water threading through cracks. What was abstract in darkness becomes tangible in light. You realize that throughout this night, the valley never changed, only your perception shifted. History works the same way. Events remain fixed in time, but interpretation moves like plates, like glaciers, like language itself. Iceland today stands as a small, modern nation intertwined with global systems, renewable energy powering homes, artists shaping international culture, immigrants weaving new threads into old fabric, leaders elected through ballots rather than battle, and yet the essential rhythm feels consistent. Gather, speak, listen, adapt. That's joke number 3. Warm and gentle. Perhaps the real Icelandic superpower, isn't volcanoes, is scheduling a meeting and actually reaching consensus. You breathe in slowly. The cold is less sharp now. Morning carries possibility rather than mystery. The wind quiets. The valley brightens fully. Somewhere beyond sight, Reykjavik stirs buses running, coffee brewing, children waking for school. Deep beneath all of it, magma shifts invisibly. Plates continue their patient divergence. And you, having traveled from the first settlers' longships to geothermal radiators, from saga manuscripts to digital diplomacy, feel the arc settle softly into stillness. There is comfort in scale, in knowing that even dramatic events become gentle ripples across centuries, in understanding that identity is not frozen, but flowing like lava cooling into land, like stories retold beside fading fires. You let your shoulders relax. The night has done its work. Now, as the light grows warmer and the details of the world sharpen, you allow your thoughts to slow. The arguments quiet. The dates blur into gentle impressions. The names soften. The valley remains. The earth hums. And you can rest. Take one last slow breath of the crisp Icelandic morning. Feel the steady ground beneath you, ancient and patient. Let the stories drift like mist, lifting off the rocks. Law and lava, sagas and suffrage, driftwood churches and digital cables, all of it settling into a calm, distant glow. Nothing demands your attention now. The plates will keep moving without you watching. The sun will continue its arc. The Alþingi will meet in Reykjavik rather than this field, but the spirit of assembly endures. Elves literal or literary can mind their own business for the day. You have traveled across 1,000 years without leaving your seat. And now, gently, you can let it all fade into quiet.